All right, good afternoon, everyone. And on behalf of SaskSoil, welcome to our 34th Annual Soil Health Conference. Good soil makes for good food. My name is Mark Heimer. I am the president of SaskSoil's Board of Director, and I will be emceeing for you today. I would like to begin by acknowledging that the land which we gather is on Treaty 4 territory, the traditional territory of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. Whether you are joining us virtually or in person, we'd like to thank you for attending and supporting SaskSoil. We have a great lineup of speakers today over the next day and a half, and we're really excited to see what they have to share with us. To start with, I think I would like to introduce our board, just so everyone knows who they are and who they can bug if even the littlest thing goes wrong. So you can, they're just at your disposal at all times. So at the booth to the far back there is our executive director, Tanya Craddock. Raise your hand, Tanya. There you are. Rob Wonder. Go ahead and stand up, Rob. There you go. Perfect. Derek Axton stepped out of the room so he wouldn't have to. Okay. Cody Straza. Marissa Borgo. Austin Barton. Oh, we're going to have to get these guys that are out in the hallway in trouble. Charles Deschamps. And I believe we have a few board members that aren't here, Tyler Wilson and Carla Rudolph, but any of those people, if you see them wandering around and you need a hand with anything, just don't be afraid to ask. So in this room is a collection of very passionate and knowledgeable people in the fields of agriculture, of research, and food. I'd like to take a moment to encourage everyone here today to start up a conversation with as many people as you possibly can. Between the speakers, the SaskSoil board members, or just the people sitting at your table, there's a lot of people you can learn from, and I don't think you'll regret it if you take the opportunity to try. Just a few housekeeping things. So if everyone could double check their phones. This is an event we're using the Whova app, so we do expect people to be off and on their phones all day long, but if you could please turn the ringer off, that would be greatly appreciated. There are continuing education credit for today's event. If anyone has any interest in that or has any trouble in getting signed up, talk to Tanya. And, one other thing that I was asked to relay, we had an early registration contest for the conference, and the winner, I apologize for my voice, I apparently had a cold last week and it decided to stick around for a little while longer, but the winner of this was Patrick Fabian, so if we could give him a hand of, yeah. So Patrick has won his registration back, so congratulations. All right, I would also like to take a minute to thank our sponsors. With events like this, sponsors they're just the only way that we can make things function and flow as well as we have, and I'd like to take a minute to show our appreciation. So A&W, South of the Divide Action Plan, Saskatchewan Stock Growers Foundation, Grain Millers, Imperial Seed, Ducks Unlimited Canada, Alice New Acre Project, Sask Mustard, Sask Wheat, Federated Co-op, Western Grains Research Foundation, Angelic, Prairie Mechanics Corp., FCC, Sask Oats, Sask Pulse Growers, MNP, and K-Hard Industries. If I ask everybody to give these sponsors a round of applause, please. All right, I think that is everything that I was supposed to do as far as getting everybody to sit down and behave and welcome you here, and I think we're ready. I'll ask Chuck to come up and introduce our first speaker.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chuck Deschamps. I'm with Ducks and Laminate Canada, and it's my pleasure to introduce to you today our first speaker, David Montgomery. Unfortunately, David is unable to join us today in person, so he will be here virtually, but I'm sure his talk will be quite good. David is a MacArthur Fellow and Professor of Geomorphology at the University of Washington. He is an internationally recognized geologist who studies landscape evolution and the effects of geological processes on ecological systems and human societies. An author of award-winning popular science books, he has been featured in the documentary films, network, and cable news, and on a wide variety of TV and radio programs, including Nova, PBS, NewsHour, Fox and Friends, and All Things Considered. His books have been translated into 9 languages. He lives in Seattle with his wife, Anne, who will also be a speaker today, and their black lab guide dog dropout, Loki. So it's my pleasure to introduce you today on behalf of SaskSoil's David Montgomery.
It's a pleasure to be here virtually. I apologize for my situation at the moment where I'm not able to travel, but delighted that Anne was able to make it. You'll meet her later this afternoon and hear a lot more from her as well today. So let me get started with what we're really trying to tell you about, which is coming up here. Because Anne and I have spent a good part of the last 10, 15 years working on the series of books that you see up on the screen now. I'm a geologist by background and training, and Anne is a biologist by background and training. And if you wonder why we would be working and thinking about the history of humanity's relationship to soils and what it's done to us and for us and what we've done to it and for it, on the reverse, think about what makes for good, healthy, fertile soil. It's the marriage of geology and biology. And so perhaps Anne and I were naturally gravitating towards this. The one class we took in graduate school together was actually a soil science class. So we're going to talk to you today. You're going to hear a lot about these 4 books, and I'm going to be talking to you about that first one, Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations, and Growing a Revolution, the third one. But if you look at this as an intellectual journey, which it has been for Anne and I, it started off with that Dirt book and thinking about what is the relationship of past societies and civilizations to the land that they occupied and how they treated the land influenced the course and fate of their civilizations and the prosperity of their descendants. It's about history. It's the kind of book you might expect a geologist to write about soils. The Hidden Half of Nature, the second one in the series, is one that Anne and I worked on together that looked at the role of microbial life, what we called the hidden half of nature, in not only building and maintaining soil fertility, but also what goes on in the human gut and the parallels between those 2 different systems, and the importance of microbiomes, the world of microbial ecology, in the health of their host organisms. And she'll talk to you much more about that after this talk. I'll also talk to you this morning about Growing a Revolution, which is, in effect, the optimistic sequel to the Dirt book. And that'll become more clear as I go into talking about that, but it's more about how to apply the science from the hidden half of nature to help address some of the problems that I wrote about in Dirt. And it's a forward-looking book about that involved interviews with farmers around the world about what's working in terms of soil building practices. And then Anne will talk later today about our most recent book, What Your Food Ate, which basically extends the work that we were doing on the relationship of how people treat the land to the health of the soil, to looking at how the health of the soil translates into human health, not only at a societal level, but also at the level of our own individual bodies. So I'm going to be getting into these mostly Dirt and Growing a Revolution this morning, but what I want to start with, Somehow that bounced out of screen sharing mode. So let's see if that will work a little better. What I wanted to start with was a quiz, because I am a university professor after all, as you might be able to tell from the office behind me. But the quiz is fairly simple, and there's not necessarily a correct answer to this, although I have my own preferred answer. But which of these planets would you rather live on? The blue one, Earth, or the red one, Mars? I routinely ask my undergraduate classes about this, and occasionally we get a few people who would really like to go colonize Mars. Maybe, perhaps they'll be astronauts of the future, but what is it that makes most of us pick that blue planet? It's habitable. What makes Earth habitable? Well, it's blue. There's lots of water on Earth. We know that there's some water on Mars. There probably used to be more water on Mars, but there's not a lot of water today. The other thing that Mars is missing is an atmosphere. And on the picture of Earth here, those white clouds, it stands in for the atmosphere. It's very convenient to not only have drinking water, but to be able to breathe on a habitable planet. But and most people, if I ask an undergraduate class of, what makes Earth habitable, those two things, water and an atmosphere, come into play fairly readily. What all too often people leave off the table is this little patch of brown over here. Soil, dirt, fertile soil. Earth is the only planet that we know of that actually has soil, and soil being the confluence of the dead world of geology and the living world of biology. It is essentially the third ingredient that makes Earth a habitable planet. But what's the state of the soils today around the world? This map that I'm showing you is the UN's global map of soil degradation from a few years back now. It's kind of out of date, but it's painted with a very fuzzy brush. But it makes a key point that there's a lot of degraded soils in the world. If you look at the legend down there at the bottom, that red is very degraded soils. There's each of those red zones around the world are areas where the soils have been degraded enough to actually affect agricultural productivity. There's the degraded soils, the yellow stuff. It's like most of the world's agricultural soils, and even a few beyond that. But the key point that I want to make here is actually twofold. The first one is that if we look at the magnitude of soil degradation around the world, most of the credible estimates of how much land has been degraded over our post-glacial history of agriculture is roughly about a third of the world's potentially arable, potentially farmable land has been degraded enough that it's been taken out of production. And what are some of the areas like that? Well, Syria and Libya are two of the sort of prime examples of that, where we have a good Roman tax records of high wheat harvests in areas that are not able to sustain those harvests today. But this is painting with a broad brush, and I would argue that you could go into any one of those red zones on this map, and you'd be able to find farms that are actually building healthy, fertile soils. Therein lies the optimistic end of what I'm now going to be talking about in terms of the past degradation. We can actually reverse the soil degradation, and I would argue we could do it at a global level, and that it is imperative that we do so this century if we think about how to actually feed the world in the coming centuries. And that's what I wrote about in Writing Dirt. I wrote about the backstory of the degradation of land around the world, how the way that societies have treated their land affected the way that the land can actually support their descendants, or not, as the case has been in cases like Syria and Libya and some other areas around the world. So it's a book mostly about history, but I thought I was wanting to write a book about the history of soil erosion, and I ended up really writing a book about the history of farming and its relationship to soil erosion. So where are we today? Well, this problem of land degradation is not just one of ancient history. It's not just a problem of what people have done in the past. It's an ongoing problem that is what I like to think of as a slow motion global crisis in terms of land degradation. The most recent global assessment that I've seen is the UN's Global State of the Soil Assessment back from 2015, when they concluded in the executive summary that humanity, the global us, is losing about 0.3% of our global food production capacity each and every year to ongoing soil loss and soil degradation. Now, 0.3% is not a terribly large number. That's probably about the interest that we're all getting on our savings accounts these days. It takes a while for it to add up. But if you think about that over the course of the next century, something that a geologist would consider a fairly short period of time, we're on track currently to degrade almost another third of the world's agricultural production capacity by the end of this century. And And if we've already degraded in a fairly serious way up to about a third of the world's agricultural land, we're on track by the end of this century to have potentially seriously degraded about half of the ability of this planet to grow food to support a growing human population. That should be of concern to anybody who's interested in the future of their descendants, because these problems can play out slowly year to year, but they can add up to have big effects in the end if trends are maintained generation after generation. So this problem of soil degradation is not just one of ancient history, it's an ongoing global problem. But if you look back at the history of past societies, there's actually a very interesting confluence of archaeology and soil science and geology through the lens of soil erosion, where we can look at and find, as I researched in Writing Dirt, that soil erosion and soil degradation played a role, and I would argue a key role, in the demise of many ancient civilizations, starting from Neolithic or Bronze Age Europe, actually going back earlier than that to ancient Mesopotamia, and classical Greece, Rome, the southern United States, the southeastern seaboard of the United States, Central America. The list goes on. I wrote about all the ones that I could find in Writing Dirt, and what I basically unearthed was a common storyline through the history of many societies, in that soil erosion played a role in undermining their long-term stability. And it wasn't just deforestation that was the culprit. That's what you find when you go to most environmental history textbooks for explanations about, well, what caused the soil erosion that influenced past societies? Because the idea that there's a connection there is not a terribly new one. There's been a number of books written over the past 150 years on this subject, many of which are very insightful and a good read still. But what I found in Writing Dirt was that it wasn't so much deforestation, it was the farming that followed, it was the plow that followed. It wasn't the axe, it was the plow that actually majorly contributed to the problem of topsoil degradation and soil loss for many societies all around the world. So what is it about the plow that's sort of a fundamental icon of agriculture, not just of modern agriculture, but of agriculture for centuries? The problem is that it fundamentally alters the balance between soil production and soil erosion on our farmland, dramatically resulting in a dramatic increase in soil erosion. How does that work? Well, think about what a plow does. I mean, one of the reasons it makes for such really good weed control is that it's like a blank slate for vegetation on the surface. By inverting the soil and giving you a fresh surface to work with, it facilitates planting, but it also leaves the ground vulnerable to erosion by water or by wind. And that can really add up over time. And when you think about soil as a system, as something that doesn't just exist, but that is created and that can be lost and that can be maintained. Think about it as a system much like our individual bank accounts. We all have income, well, most of us have income and expenses and some magnitude of savings. And we know that having done this myself a few times, if you spend money faster than you make it for long enough, you run out of you can burn through your savings. This is the same deal with soil, if you think about it, as the natural capital that civilizations use to help to help feed their populace and keep themselves in business. And so if the pace of soil erosion outstrips the pace at which we're building soils, whether from rocks or sediments, if that pace of erosion exceeds the pace of replacement of soils for long enough, you can essentially erode through the soil that's on a landscape and burn through a society's natural endowment of fertile soil. That's what's happened time and again in different regions around the world, but at a pace that's slow enough that it rarely becomes the crisis du jour, even though, as we'll see, people have been concerned about this problem for a long time. Fortunately, I think there's ways to actually redress that problem and solve it going forward. But in Writing Dirt, I was looking backwards. So let's look at one of those societies. Let's look at classical Greece, ancient Greece, as an example. I'll spare you all the examples I could go through in terms of the historical effects of soil erosion. Obviously, I recommend the book if you're really interested in history, but I'll try and crystallize the key lessons for that in this talk today. So if we look at classical Greece, the southern Greece, we can find that cycles of soil erosion, and soil formation really began in the Bronze Age, several thousand years before the time of Christ, right after the introduction of plow-based agriculture. So when the plow arrived from areas over in Asia Minor onto the Greek landscape, and the Greeks started working their land with the plow, it really changed the nature of their landscape and how erosion was working on their landscape. And Tjeerd Van Andels, the gentleman who actually taught me my sophomore level geology when I was an undergraduate, he was working with an archaeologist, Chris Runnels, back in the 1980s, reconstructing the history of the Greek landscape. And this shows you a typical hill slope profile from their work of a Greek hillside at the end of the last ice age. So coming into the modern, more warmer world that agriculture has flourished in for the last 10,000 years, the Greek landscape, if you basically took a D9 or something and dug a trench from the top of the ridge down to the bottom of the valley bottom, this is kind of what you'd see. There's open oak woodland with an relatively open terrain below, 1 to 3 feet of soil on the hillsides above rock, and then alluvium sediments, stream sediments down in the valley bottom. So in the initial post-glacial world, the landscape was covered by a couple feet of soil across much of the landscape. And Van Andels and Runnels documented how over time, once cultivation arrived, once the plow arrived and farming spread up across the hills in the Greek landscape, the situation started to change. Now, where do you think that they actually started farming in classical Greece? Well, it was actually down on the valley bottoms. Why? It's relatively flat land with readily worked soils with close to a water supply. But as the Greek population rose, they were documented that grain fields spread up onto the surrounding hillsides. And then the Greeks, if you read the sort of few surviving works that reference agriculture in both Greek and Roman times, plowing was a very popular activity, done multiple times a year to work the fields. And grain fields spread up onto the hillsides to feed the growing populace of classical Greece. And that started the erosion that ended up stripping soils off the hillsides and piling it up down in the valley bottoms, both from erosion overland flow erosion that gradually delivered sediment, and also from landslides off some of the steeper slopes once they were cleared and plowed. Then debris piled up in the valley bottoms, leaving bare, thin soils and the hospitable to only maquis vegetation that can grow on fairly bad soils, but it made it fairly difficult to work the upland soils in terms of cultivation. Now, when you think about what it takes to support a populace on a landscape, you think about it's not so much the thickness of the soil. Well, if you take a thin layer of soil and pile it all up in one spot in the valley bottoms, you've really limited the ability of that landscape to grow food because you've taken a fair amount of the area out of food production. So it's not so much the area covered by soil or the amount of soil in the landscape. If you take it and you pile it all up in one spot, you're not going to be able to produce as much food. So soil erosion, as Van Andels and Runnels documented, really undermined the agricultural productivity of classical Greece in a way that influenced the population density, the ability of the land to support people. In their work, they also looked at reconstructing the population density. In this case, I'm showing you the graph that shows the amount of people living in the southern Argolid, an area of a particular valley in southern Greece. And you'll notice the time scale across here in the bottom goes from almost 6,000 BC. So the first arrival of agriculture into the region, where the population then rose gradually over the course of a couple thousand years. And then as a result of Bronze Age farming spreading up onto the hillsides. And then there was a crash in the population and a dark age before the rise of the classical Greek civilization, in which, in the millennia before the time of Christ and up to around 0 AD, that classical age of Greece, the population rose again, and then it crashed in another dark age, and then it's risen again in the modern age in more recent times. And this one graph is really one of the major reasons I started thinking about and researching and writing the Dirt Book, because it intrigued me. Two characteristics of it really intrigued me. One of which is actually fairly trivial, but it's interesting nonetheless, and that is essentially, why would the magnitude of the population on each of these cycles increase each time through? So why does a rise, crash, rise, crash, rise, and the peaks keep getting bigger each time? And I think the obvious answer to that is that technology today is a lot better than in the Bronze Age. We can feed a lot more people on less land using the technology that we have available today than they could back then. So that's kind of a no-brainer, really, I think. But what sets the periodicity? Why, a couple thousand-year rise, then a thousand-year crash, another thousand-year rise, and a thousand-year crash, and then a third rise? It's that periodicity that really got me wondering about how do the pace of soil building and the pace of soil erosion affect the ability of a landscape to support a population? And could there be a connection to the kind of dynamic that we see in a graph like this? So that got me working and thinking on the problem of how does soil erosion and land degradation influence human populations over the long run? And it turns out that this idea that soil erosion and how we work the land has influenced the course and fate of human societies, as exciting as I thought that was to see the connections in society after society, it turns out that's actually a pretty old idea. The classical Greek philosopher Plato, who was writing at the time of that second peak in the population graph that I just showed you, wrote about the effects of soil erosion on the demise of the Bronze Age Greek civilization, the one before his civilization in classical times. And in his words, I have this extract from one of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, if I'm remembering the dialogue right. He has this wonderful descriptions of how soil erosion was occurring, and if you went to the lands that were to the deltas that were downstream of fields that were very intensively farmed, the deltas were building out into the Mediterranean, lots of sediment coming down the river systems. But if you went to the forested catchments, the rivers where the land had not yet been cleared, the water ran clear and clean, and the delta was not building out into the Mediterranean. And so he wrote, in describing all this, that the rich, soft soil has all run away, leaving the land nothing but skin and bone. But in those days, the damage had not taken place. The hills had high crests, the rocky plain of Phelus was covered with rich soil, and the mountains were covered by thick woods, of which there are some traces today. He recognized the connection between how people were treating the land, and in particular how tillage, in effect, was causing erosion off the land, and that had reduced the fertility of the Greek peninsula to the point where the land was not able to support the population that was capable of generating the large armies that he thought was needed to basically defend their territory. So the idea that soil erosion could affect the course and fate of human societies is one that has almost 2,500 years of thinking behind it. But that doesn't mean it's just ancient history or out of style. It's a problem that is still one that is relevant today. And I generally find when I talk about soil erosion that it's best to pick on my own home state of Washington. So I'm going to do that now for a couple minutes. And this shows you a picture of a winter wheat field in Washington State back in the 1970s that really captures well why a geologist like myself would think about tillage as an incredibly destructive act if it's followed by rainfall. Because this winter wheat field, you'll notice it's in between crops, so it's during the fallow period when rain fell on the fields, and all those little channels are carved into it. There's small channels that we call rills. They're an agronomic nuisance. You can just plow right over them and erase them with a single pass of the plow. But what happens to the soil that's been moved? How does it work when that happens year after year? It can really add up over time to the magnitude of effects that are fairly large and fairly serious for societies. This, for example, shows you another photograph from the Palouse region in eastern Washington, and it is taken back in 1961 by Vern Kaiser. And what it shows you is a feature that's actually fairly common across the region, which is a cliff at the edge of a field. This fence up here in the upper right is a field that the farmer is a fence that the farmer built around their water cistern to protect their water supply. Back when the land was first cleared back in 1911, the soil was up at that level. And over the next 50 years, from 1911 to 1961, this cliff developed at the edge of the field due to, well, pretty much two things. Those little rills happening in between planted crops, so when the land was tilled and rain fell, you get erosion that like is in that last slide, but also from the uniformly downward movement of just tillage erosion, the plow translating soil down little bit by bit every year away from that fence line. So how big a deal is this? How high is that cliff? This little black line that you can probably see on your screen here, running from about there to there, is a 1 foot increment on a survey rod that they were using to survey this drop that's kind of washed out in the negative. But that's 1 foot, so this is about a 5 foot cliff. 5 feet of erosion in 50 years translates into about a foot of erosion every decade. That's roughly an inch a year. Excuse me. There's nowhere on Earth that soils are built at a pace of an inch a year. Except maybe my wife's garden, as she'll talk about a little later, and in places where one can actually build soils by putting organic matter back into the soil as opposed to building soil from scratch. But the point is that this soil loss rate of about an inch a year is an incredibly fast rate that's very difficult for nature to actually keep up with, and therein embodies and exemplifies the long-term problem of soil erosion. But that's one area of one field, and I hope that you're in one state, and I hope you were sitting there going, well, Dave, isn't that a pretty extreme example? And of course it is. That's why I like to use it. It's the most extreme photograph I can find to illustrate the magnitude of what soil erosion can do in a field over just a few decades. So let's expand our scope here for a little bit beyond a corner of a single field in western Washington, and let's look at the southeastern seaboard of the United States, an area that extends from Virginia down to Alabama on the eastern seaboard. This gray noodle is the Piedmont or hill country of that region. So it's an area that's downslope of the high spine of the Appalachians, and it's upslope from the broad coastal plains. This area was one of the original breadbaskets of the early North American colonies. It was very aggressively farmed in early colonial times, and this shows you in the different colors that are up there the magnitude of topsoil loss that Bob Mead and colleagues at the USGS documented back in the 1980s, if I remember the dates right on this. But the key thing here is notice that gray color extending over pretty much that whole noodle of the Piedmont, or the upland hill country, the area where you might expect erosion to be a potential problem. 4 to 10 inches of soil loss, topsoil loss, in a few centuries of post-colonial agricultural activity. How big a deal is that? Well, if you go back and you read the original journals of settlers in this region, they will describe the original European settlers in this region. They'll describe 6 to 12 inches of rich, black, fertile soil above reddish topsoil. But if you go visit this region today, what you mostly find is that subsoil, that reddish subsoil exposed at the surface. The topsoil is virtually gone across a pretty broad region of what was a major agricultural region in the early British colonies. And that illustrates quite well, I think, what the Greeks and Romans could have done with much longer run at their homeland landscapes. The Greeks having a 1,000-year run at it, or the Romans who had a similar story to the classical Greeks with their 1,000-year run at farming practices in central Italy. It puts into perspective the idea that this problem of topsoil erosion and soil loss, if it is maintained for long enough, can really add up to a major problem in terms of loss of the topsoil. And this is something that did not go unnoticed at the time. There's this wonderful letter from George Washington to Alexander Hamilton in 1796, and when Washington was writing about the problem of the degraded state of lands in that gray noodle that I was just showing you, and also some of the areas in the coastal plains, where he wrote that a few years more of increased sterility will drive the inhabitants of the Atlantic states westward for support, whereas if they were taught how to improve the old, instead of going in pursuit of new and productive soils, they would make these acres which now scarcely yield them anything turn out beneficial to themselves. Washington and his peers were complaining about the declining fertility of American farms before the United States existed as a country and into the early days of our countryhood. He was experimenting with filling gullies and planting cover crops and crop rotations, things we'll return to talking about in a few minutes. But there was a recognition of the destructive effects of a style of agriculture that left the ground vulnerable to erosion by wind or rain, in that erosion adding up to effects on the land over the long run. And his prognosis was really correct. There was a great emptying out of that gray noodle that I showed you in the run-up to the American Civil War, and the state of the agricultural lands in the southeastern seaboard was actually a factor that played into the run-up to and the onset of the Civil War, as I talked about in the Dirt Book. Now, I'll save you all the details of all that. Obviously, encourage the students of history to look at that. But we can see similar things today in Central America, for example. I imagine that many of you had coffee this morning, and these two pictures are from the heart of coffee country down in Central America, an area that I went to in researching Growing a Revolution, the book that I'll get to in a little bit. But what this shows you is the difference in the soil on the same hillside, so it's the same mountainside, whereas on the photograph on the left shows you the soil that's under the native jungle vegetation. My little notebook there is about 8 inches tall. To give you perspective, there's at least a foot of rich, fertile, black topsoil above the reddish tropical subsoil on this hillside that's never been worked for agriculture. It also illustrates why geologists love road cuts. We can just drive up, see the soil, see what we're doing. This other exposure on the right is a road cut that is through a coffee plantation developed on the same area with the same general slope, same general vegetation. But you notice that something's missing, and that would be the topsoil. There's a thin layer of organic matter below the vegetation, and the subsoil goes right to the surface. This area has only been farmed for about 100 years. They've managed to actually shed virtually the entire topsoil with just 100 years of farming in this part of Central America, and they're having horrible problems with a Rioja coffee blight that relates to the poor health of their soils, as you can intuit from the difference from the missing topsoil on this comparison. So the problem of topsoil loss and degradation is not just one that has affected societies in the past, although it has had a major impact on societies in the past. It's a problem that affects societies at present as well. And this is a question that I wanted to look into when I was writing the Dirt Book, is, back in Roman times and Greek times, we didn't have geologists or geographers or engineers who were studying how fast soils are eroding off of different landscapes. But we have a lot of data today that we can use to document that. So one of the things that I did in writing that book is I went to the library for about a month when my grad students were out in the field doing their own work, and I gathered up all the data that I could find from the published literature about how fast are the world's farms eroding. And I came up with, there's quite a range of values, but a global average was about 1.5 millimeters per year from conventionally worked, tilled, or plowed farms. Now that 1.5 millimeters per year is not a very fast number. That's your fingernails grow faster than that. It's kind of slow. It's hard to get excited about something that happens 1.5 millimeters a year. But at that pace, it only takes 20 years to lose an inch of fertile topsoil. And if you recall, many landscapes only have 6 to 12 inches of topsoil. 6 times 20 years is just over a century. That gets you to that Central America example I showed you a minute ago. The problem with soil erosion, a key problem with it, is that it happens slowly year to year by any kind of human measures. But if it keeps happening, it can add up surprisingly fast in terms of how nature can keep up with it or not. So how fast does nature actually make soil? That same month I spent in the library, I also gathered up all the data I could find about, globally, how fast are soils made? How fast does nature make soils? And that's that blue number down there, about 2% of a millimeter per year. At that pace, it takes 1,000 years or so to make an inch topsoil. This is something that highlights the real problem here, the difference between that blue number and that red number on the screen. If we're losing topsoil at a pace of inches in decades, and we can only replace it in terms of inches per centuries, if not millennia, then it's only a matter of time before societies that engage in practices that are erosive or are this erosive lose their topsoil. I wrote this up in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences of the United States a few years back in 2007, and the problem is one that has not been, it's a problem that others have actually looked at and come to fairly similar conclusions since then. These are the two most recent examples of really excellent studies looking at historical erosion rates, erosion over the last century and a half across the Corn Belt of the United States, or the Midwest of the United States, in that top one, where the median historical erosion rate was about 1.8 millimeters per year, a little higher than the global average I came up with in the study that I had done. In terms of the soil loss across the United States Corn Belt, so that's the northern part of the plains, basically the same research group found that 35%, more than a third of the entire area, had lost its entire A horizon soil. In other words, the topsoil was gone from about a third of the U.S. Corn Belt. And what that necessitates is, with the poor soil health that arises from missing the topsoil, which is where most of the fertility in soil is held, means that large amounts of fertilizer and supplemental agrochemicals are needed to maintain high harvest. The natural fertility of the land has been degraded to the point that farmers in the areas that have lost their topsoil are pretty much hooked on large chemical inputs to maintain their outputs. But what I found intriguing about this is that the global story that I told in Riding Dirt is one where subsequent workers using more sophisticated techniques and GIS and a whole bunch of other things across large areas of landscape are coming up with numbers that are fairly close to the averages that I came up with my fairly crude work at a global level. So I've given you so far the data that it would take to actually predict for yourself, well, how long could an agricultural civilization last engaging in farming practices that were as erosive as is typical for modern and ancient farming practices. And we can walk through the calculation fairly simply. That net soil loss on the order of 1 millimeter a year implies that erosion of a 0.5 meter to 1 meter thick hill slope soil, a 1 to 3 foot thick hill slope soil, would only take 500 to 1,000 years. Now, to a geologist, that's really fast. To any of us in our daily lives, that's a pretty long time. But what I found intriguing about this, back to that example of the Greek landscape and its population density oscillations over time, is that 1,000 years plus or minus is approximately the lifespan of most major civilizations outside of major river floodplains, and it's approximately the time scale of that periodicity to the population dynamics of the Greek landscape. One of the few places in the world where there's been 3 successive civilizations on the same piece of land. So what is it about major river floodplains that are the exception to this? Well, it's a very intriguing example because it basically really reinforces the point. What happens on big river floodplains? And these are the places that I hope that you're thinking are exceptions to the idea that civilizations only last 1,000 years, like the Nile. It's been farmed for thousands of years. The Tigris and Euphrates rivers in ancient Mesopotamia and modern Iraq. The Indus and the Brahmaputra in India, the big rivers of lowland China. Those are all major river floodplains where people have farmed, for centuries and thousands of years. What is it about those geographies that make them fairly resilient to the problem of soil erosion? They're floodplains. And what happens in a floodplain? It floods. And what do floods bring? Silt, sand, clay, sediment, not just water. So floods, if a flood would deposit, on average, a single grain of sand each year. A grain of sand is from 0.5 millimeter to 2 millimeters in diameter, so roughly 1 millimeter. That single grain of sand could offset that long-term average rate of soil loss that we've been looking at here. So big river floodplains are very resilient to long-term soil loss, but once farming gets up onto the hillsides around floodplains, that story changes. So let's look at this, and it's not just soil erosion that is a big component of land degradation. It's also the loss of soil organic matter, the loss of carbon from the soils. And if there's a review back in 2015 in the journal Sustainability that looked at the soil organic matter content of North American farmland soils, and it came to the conclusion that many of the soils across North America, that soil organic matter, the SOM content, was about 50%, about half of the level that they were when they were first converted from farms or prairies, or from forests or prairies to farmlands. In other words, we've not only lost the soil itself, our topsoil, but we've been losing the organic matter content of the soil that's left behind. And what does that look like? It looks a lot like the comparison of these two soils. These two soils are from that gray noodle in the American Southeast, from 2 farms, adjacent farms in North Carolina. They're literally just across the fence line. And I was working on an episode of the TV show Nova a few years back, and they wanted to illustrate what had changed to the soils in the region. And I thought, oh, well, let's put down a white tablecloth. Let's just get a sample of the soil from a conventional tobacco plantation over here on the right. It's been conventionally worked for the last 150 years. It's khaki soil. It's dry and crusty, lots of salts in it. It's exposed. The soil on the left is from what had been a neighboring farm, but that was abandoned in the 1850s in that move westward that George Washington predicted due to the degraded state of the soil there. And you'll notice that it has a lot darker color, even though it has the same parent material. So it's the same basic stuff that the soil is made out of, but it's been in the same climate. What's different over the last 150 years is how the land has been worked. So this illustrates to you how fast human activity can change the landscape and how fast nature can actually recover and reintegrate organic matter into soils if they're not farmed in ways that would degrade that organic matter. This is essentially an analog for what had happened in the region before that, where farmland soils had been converted into soil a lot like this, which is the kind of soil that George Washington was complaining about in terms of the relative infertility of it. And that boils down to carbon. Soil organic matter is roughly 40% carbon, and the loss of organic matter really differentiates these two soils. This one looks like California beach sand more than really good fertile soil, and in part because that is the parent material, beach sand, obviously not from California, but from the eastern seaboard. But the parent material for this stuff is identical. What's different is how the land was treated, how people treated the land. That brought up the real question for me in terms of, is soil restoration possible? Can we actually reverse the historical pattern of land degradation that we've seen in society after society? And that was a big question I was wrestling with as I finished writing the dirt book. And, to be honest, I wrestled mightily with how to write the last chapter of that book, because the first couple iterations of it were kind of depressing. It's like, oh, we're on track to really, destroy the world's soil in the way that regional societies had done in the past, much to the detriment of their descendants. And I struggled to find, the way forward in completing dirt. I managed to pull a bit of an optimistic thread together in the end. But it really started asking me this question of how feasible is soil restoration? Could we actually rebuild healthy, fertile soils on full-scale, viable farms that would be capable of feeding the world? And the part of the answer to that came to me, or part of the reason for optimism came to me in a place that you might not expect a geologist to do a lot of field work, and that's my own backyard. Because I had the good fortune to marry a biologist who's also an avid gardener. And as I was finishing writing the dirt book about how societies had destroyed their land time and again around the world, Ann and I bought a house in North Seattle, and she started to work on the garden in ways that she'll talk to you more about in her talk later this afternoon. But that we wrote about in The Hidden Half of Nature. And I'm not going to steal the thunder from that talk too much, other than to show that this is what resulted from the fruits of her labor in terms of regenerative gardening practices. This is the soil that we started with, had less than 1% organic matter in it. This is the soil that we had as of a couple years ago when we took the photograph. It was getting up to about 8% or more organic matter, very carbon rich for soil. And this was done over the course of a little more than a decade. That started, seeing those changes happen, right in front of my eyes, right in the backyard, and seeing the transformation and the life in the soil and the life above ground thriving as a result of building healthy, fertile soils, really made me wonder about, well, this is great. Could we do this at scale on fully viable commercial farms in different parts of the world? And what on earth was going on to allow us to actually enhance the soil that quickly at a pace that is really much faster than you'll find in journal articles about, well, how fast does nature build soil? It started making me wonder whether, can people build soil much faster than nature? And it turns out that's a lot of what we looked into in writing The Hidden Half of Nature, is that a lot of the answer boils down to what happens below ground in the soil food web. Anne used a lot of compost and mulch, but it was the life in the soil that was instrumental in turning that material into the organic matter that fueled the growth of organisms within the soil and the growth and health of the plants and it turned out animals also in the yard over the subsequent years as she was restoring our soil. So she'll tell you a lot more about that story. But I started the example of what happened in our yard really made me start to think of, wow, okay, so if we could restore the soil in our urban lot in North Seattle, what's the potential for doing it on farms around the world? And to let the cat out of the bag a little bit, I spent some time looking at agricultural practices around the world that had regenerated healthy, fertile soils on economically viable farms. And the contrast that I found was really one through the contrast between conventional agriculture that emphasizes soil chemistry and soil physics, both of which are incredibly important for soil fertility. Is not to underplay them, but that there's a key element that has been essentially underappreciated and left out of the mix in thinking about the theory behind conventional agriculture today, and that is the role of soil biology and soil life. And that's what regenerative agriculture focuses on, is it emphasizes cultivating the life in the soil as the key to unlocking that chemistry in the soil and to enabling the physics in the soil to actually help to rebuild organic matter and the native fertility of soils as a consequence of intensive farming. And that's the story that I told in Growing a Revolution, where I took 6 months of time off from teaching at the University of Washington, where I teach, and I visited farmers around the world who had restored life to their land in the same way that Anne had restored life to our yard and built her garden. I basically went to farmers who had converted soil like this khaki soil that looks like that North Carolina tobacco plantation into this dark, much richer, organic matter-rich soil on the right. And these are cores from Ratan Lal's experimental plots at the Ohio State University, where he's been working on this issue for quite some time. So I talked to experts like him, to farmers around the world, and what I basically found, from whether these were farmers on subsistence farms in Africa and Costa Rica, or large-scale mechanized operations across North America and up into your neck of the woods in Saskatchewan, I found that the farmers who had been very successful at rebuilding healthy, fertile soils as a consequence of farming practices adopted practices that adhered to the 3 basic principles of what the United Nations calls conservation agriculture. And those principles are to involve minimal or no disturbance of the soil. So that's to minimize both the physical and chemical disturbance of the soil, which either means going no-till or low-till, and using minimal chemical use, and also combining that with maintaining a permanent ground cover, which in practice translates into cover crops or companion cropping, really, and growing diverse crop rotations. Not just growing 1 or 2 things on the same piece of ground over and over again, but essentially growing a diversity of crops, which could come in terms of the diversity of cover crops in between cash crops, or it could come in terms of a more complex cash crop rotation. Why is it that this combination of practices really works very well to restore the health and fertility of agricultural land? Well, that's what those little microbes are doing up on the screen here as well, to remind me to say that this recipe of minimal disturbance, cover crops, and diverse rotations is a recipe for supporting and cultivating the beneficial life in the soil. Think about it in terms of sort of our own terms. This minimal disturbance, that's about maintaining habitat that is that can support their lives and life styles. Think about what would happen if every year someone took the roof off your house and put a big spoon in it and stirred up all your belongings. You wouldn't stay there very long. It would not be habitat conducive to maintaining stability. That's what a plow does to a field. And in many ways, the overuse of agrochemicals also can scramble the soil microbiome. Maintaining a permanent ground cover crops, that is the recipe for helping to get carbon into the ground, providing an on-site carbon source. Of course, one could also import sources of carbon in terms of compost and manure too, but it's hard to think about how you would do that on a very large, highly mechanized farm. And so the way to build organic matter on site is through cover crops. And the diversity of crop rotations, that's essentially about how to promote a diversity of organisms in the soil, because when you look at soil ecology and the role that soil ecology plays in nutrient cycling and building soil organic matter, it's not just about 1 or 2 species of soil life, it's about the mix of soil life. And think about how a hockey team would be completely dysfunctional if all you had were goalies. You need different positions to actually have a functional team, because different people can specialize in doing different things that need to be done to form a successful team. you can think about soil life the same way. So this combination of minimal disturbance, permanent ground cover, and diverse crop rotations is really the foundational recipe for building healthy, fertile soils. But it also happens to be about diametrically opposed to what we've been teaching for 100 years in conventional agriculture when we've taught high tillage with and functional monocultures and not doing cover crops. So it's a very different way and style of thinking about how to farm that emphasizes cultivating the beneficial life in the soil. And what I found in visiting farms around the world who had adopted these practices is that those general principles translated to pretty much every setting I visited. But the specific practices that people used were needed to be tailored to the specific setting, to the climate that people were in, to the size of their farm, to the technology they had access to the kinds of crops that they wanted to grow. Were they growing vegetables? Were they growing grains? Did they grow, both things? Did they want to reintegrate animal husbandry into their operations as a way to accelerate the process of soil rebuilding? As I'll get back to in a little bit. These were a basic takeaway for me was how the general principles for behind building life in the soil were fairly universal, but it took a lot to figure out how to actually apply them to the specific settings in different parts of the world, and that some of the early adopters of regenerative agriculture practices were very key tinkerers, shall we say, in trying to figure out how to adapt practices to their area of the world. So I'll share with you the stories from three of the farmers who were very instrumental in educating me about how it is that farmers can rebuild healthy, fertile soils in different parts of the world. And the first gentleman I'll introduce you to here is Dwayne Beck, who ran Dakota Lakes Research Farm down at South Dakota State University. He's shown outstanding in a no-till field where he was an early adopter of no-till, primarily through interest in water conservation, but then he started noticing how it affected the health of their soil, and he started getting into adding cover crops and diversifying their crop rotations, and after several decades of experimenting and coming up with a system, they found they was able to greatly reduce their diesel, fertilizer, and pesticide use on farms in his region by more than half. That's a major expense reduction for farmers. If you could cut your diesel, fertilizer, and pesticide bills by half on a conventional farm, that's a major savings in terms of money. What happened to their yields? What happened to their harvests? The numbers down here at the bottom show you the numbers he reported to me as typical for what their traditional yield had been before they adopted this combination of regenerative practices. You'll notice that the yields in the bottom actually went up. So when they went to this combination of no-till cover crops and finally added a complex rotation, they were actually harvesting more while spending less. That's a recipe for a more profitable farm. And that's what turned me into an optimist in thinking about how the ideas behind a regenerative style of agriculture could catch on in farming communities, because they seem to actually work from the economic perspective of the individual farmer. They also work in terms of helping to reduce and mitigate the magnitude of soil erosion, because one of the other things I found in writing the dirt book was that no-till farming practices and low-till farming practices can reduce the pace of soil erosion to getting close to the rate of soil production. It can basically help solve the soil loss problem, but here it looks like it can be done in a manner that's economically viable. And so when I was at Dwayne's farm, I asked him, whether the kinds of practices that he was doing would actually work on subsistence farms in Africa, where the world's population growth is actually projected to be over the course of this century. Most countries in the world outside of Africa, their population has stabilized at this point or is declining. And the next billion people that we're expecting to welcome to this planet are pretty much going to be in Africa. And so the question of, could these kind of principles and practices work on subsistence farms in Africa is a very pertinent one to a broad swath of humanity's future. And Dwayne told me, don't ask Dwayne, go talk to this gentleman here, Kofi Boa, who runs the Center for No-Till Research in Kumasi, Ghana. Notice his hat, got dirt, get soil. I knew as soon as I got out of the Land Rover to meet him that I was going to really like this guy, and that we were kind of on the same wavelength. He's been teaching people in his in and around the village that he was from to how to move from their traditional style of slash and burn agriculture, where they would clear a field, burn it, farm it for a few years, and then move on to another piece of forest. They kind of, as their population grew, they kind of ran out of new forest to clear, and their practices were not working. If you slash and burn on the same fields over and over, it's a recipe for degrading the soil. And their traditional practices applied that way, with a non-traditional lack of movement, had really taken their tropical soils from 4 to 5% organic matter down below 2%, which has a huge impact on their fertility. So what Kofi did is he taught people in the region how to farm without the plow, with no-till, and with cover crops. They grow a diversity of crops already on their farms. They tend to be very small by Western standard, very small farms by Western standards, but they grow a diversity of crops because people are growing their own food supply. So he taught them how to adopt that combination of minimal disturbance, cover crops, and no-till. And look what it did to their rate of erosion off their land. He's done experiments off of the farms that he's worked in and around. Their traditional practices, you would get almost 2,000 kilograms per hectare per year, but under no-till, you were under 100 kilograms per hectare per year. They basically shut erosion down by going to these new methods. But what happened to their ability to feed themselves? Well, under their traditional crop yields, they were getting about 1.5 tons per hectare of corn and not quite a ton, 0.8 of a ton of cowpeas per hectare. Once they figured out their new system, they were able to triple their crop yields of corn, double their crop yields of cowpeas. Let me get back here. Double their crop yields of cowpeas. Those increases, a 2 to 3-fold increase in harvest is better than the Green Revolution did in terms of changing farming practices around the world. And most of the farmers that Kofi was working with, small-scale subsistence farmers, were bypassed by the Green Revolution because they don't have any money to buy patented seeds. They don't have any money to buy fertilizer. They don't have, they lack financial resources. They have their little plots of land and their own labor. Kofi taught them a way to revolutionize their thinking and practices in a way that revolutionized their harvests that have made a huge difference economically to the village where he's from. There's also this third gentleman whose farm that I'll tell you a little bit about. David Brandt runs Brandt Family Farm in Carroll, Ohio. He's modeling a tillage radish for you here because he basically has gone to that same combination of no-till with diverse cover crops and very diverse cover crops and diverse cover crops. He sells wheat, corn, and soybeans in the North American commodity crop market, so he's not selling a diversity of crops, but he is growing a diversity of cover crops, up to 10 to 20 cover crops in fields between his cash crops. And his fields are doing really well, and he was very helpful to me in terms of comparing the economics of his farm and his neighboring farms that are primarily grow corn and soybeans without cover crops in between them. So he compared to me the basic economics of his neighbor's conventional farms, where they involved the full tillage using 200 pounds of nitrogen per acre and 2.5 quarts of Roundup of glyphosate per acre. The total cost for those farms back in 2015, from when he was quoting, was about $500 an acre. Their corn yields were about 100 bushels per acre, and at $4 a bushel, what they were getting at that time, his neighbors were losing $100 an acre. That's not a very good model for a profitable farm. The more you plant, the more money you lose. Even a geologist can tell you that that's not a terribly good business model. Compare that with what was happening on David's farm, where he had gone no-till for 44 years. He was an early adopter of no-till back in the early 1970s, but he then gradually got into cover crops and then diversifying his cover crops. He's radically improved the health of his soil, taking it from about 2% up to about 6 to 8%. He's got more carbon in his soil now than the native forest soils had, and he's not tilling. He's using about 1/10 of the nitrogen, and at the time I was talking to him, he was using roughly 1/3 or less than half of the Roundup. So he's not an organic farmer. But he was moving in a direction that I teased him was organic-ish, that he was weaning himself off of agrochemicals, of fertilizers and Roundup. And what did it cost him? $320 an acre. So he was spending less per acre than his conventional neighbors, and his yield was much higher than the county average. He was yielding 180 bushels an acre at a time when his neighbors were doing 100 bushels, and at $4 a bushel, he was making a profit of about $400 an acre. That is the other piece that started turning me into an optimist on whether regenerative farming practices could catch on. Because if they can work to greatly reduce input costs, the cost of diesel and fertilizer and pesticides, and increase harvests, it's a win-win recipe for the farmers. Why did it work so well for David? This shows you what he did to his soil by going to that combination of no-till and greatly diverse cover crops. Back in 1971, when he started, he had soil about like this. This is actually the soil from his neighbor's farm, which is literally right across a dirt road from his farm. This is the soil that David has on his farm as of 2014. You'll notice the color difference, and the color difference, that's carbon. He's taken his soil from less than 2% to about 6 to 8% carbon. It's made all the difference in the world for soil health and the productivity of his farm. The last farm that I'll show you with is Gabe Brown's farm, Brown's Ranch in Bismarck, North Dakota. Gabe has written a wonderful book about his experience as a farmer, talking about regenerating the soil on his land and regenerating a native prairie vegetation. He's been doing something that the other folks that I've been talking about so far haven't gone so far as to do, and that's reintegrating animal husbandry into his cropping operations and into practicing regenerative grazing to rebuild his native prairie. And just to show you the fruits of his labor, this shows you the soil on Gabe's market garden plot, where he brings in livestock to graze off the cover crops that he grows in and amongst and in between the harvest of vegetable crops for a farmer's market supply that he runs. And this is his neighbor's soil on his neighbor's organic farm that has fine soil, but it has nowhere near the carbon, nowhere near the life of the soil that's actually in Gabe's neighboring farm at this point. What happened in terms of Gabe's experience in rebuilding his topsoil? He's basically been measuring that back since 1993, when he started off with 3 inches of topsoil and organic matter of less than 2%. He then went into no-till. Then a couple of years later, he started to diversify his cash crops. He brought in cover crops into his operation, and then got into multi-species cover crops, a decade and a half almost after when he went to no-till. And then he started reintegrating livestock about 10 years ago or so. And notice what his soil organic matter level is as of 2010. After just about 20 years, he'd increased it from 2% to 6%. He tripled it in 20 years. And notice what happened to his topsoil depth. He took it from 3 inches to over a foot of topsoil. He's been building healthy, fertile soil at a pace that is comparable to what Ann was doing in our yard, in our garden, but Gabe's been doing it on a fully operational and profitable farm. And his story and all the travails and his learning experiences is wonderful, that it's captured in his book that I recommend to you highly. But the idea of increasing soil organic matter is one that also greatly helps to hold water in soils. For every 1% increase in organic matter, soils will actually retain an extra 20,000 gallons of plant available water per acre. A great way to enhance the resilience of farms to droughts and climate variability is to increase their soil organic matter content, so that more of the water that actually falls on the landscape stays in and near the root zone for plants to take up later, rather than running off the soil in a way that can cause soil erosion and carry away fertilizer and seeds and other things you don't want to leave the farm. So soil organic matter is not just about carbon and taking carbon from the atmosphere and putting it in soils, which climate activists are very excited about and excited about paying farmers for. But there's also advantages in terms of farming. In terms of the profitability aspect of it, the anecdotal experiences I had in visiting farmers around the world were kind of backed up by Claire Lacan and Jonathan Lundgren in a paper that they published in the journal Peer J back in 2018, the year after Growing Revolution came out, where they compared the profitability of conventional and regenerative farms growing corn on fields in the American Midwest. And what this shows you is a summary plot for them, showing you on the y-axis revenue and costs, so dollars per hectare, for both the average conventional and regenerative farms. I think they had a 20-farm comparison, if I'm remembering it right. And so in terms of the expenses, those are shown in the colored things for all these different colors keyed over there on the right. And you notice that the conventional farms were spending more than the regenerative farms. So the regenerative farms reduced their input costs. Notice a big drop in fertilizer, this sort of yellow tan color with hatches around it. You're using less than half the fertilizer. Also using less corn seed. In this case, they used about the same amount of herbicide in these two, and irrigated it less than the regenerative one. Point being that expenses were smaller than on the conventional farms. In terms of the amount of money they harvested per hectare, the regenerative farms on average had a higher level. So it's about, what is that, about maybe 15% higher or so. But the point being that this residual, if you take the total income from the fields, you might lose less expenses. That's the white thing at the bottom, left over there's profit. And the regenerative farms were substantially more profitable than the conventional farms. This again is why I'm so relatively optimistic and bullish on the idea of these regenerative soil building practices spreading, is they seem to work for a number of levels. So what are some of the benefits of healthy, fertile soils? I put higher farmer profits at the top of the list, because for farms to be sustainable, you have to sustain the farm economically. And the trend over the last 100 years has been all too regularly towards squeezing farmers between the high cost of inputs and the low returns, low prices of the crops that they grow, that they get. And this regenerative farming seems to be a way to actually reverse that a bit. And perhaps substantially so. And how does that work? Well, if you can harvest comparable yields after conversion, after a short transition period, and spend less on fertilizer, pesticide, and fossil fuels, that's a recipe for a more profitable farm. But there's also off-farm benefits. The increased amount of soil carbon not only benefits soil fertility and the farm, but it also takes carbon out of the atmosphere. And we're never going to solve the climate change problem through farming practices that take carbon and put it back in the soil. It's just too big a lift. But it could be a huge contributor towards that. And there's a great potential for farmers to be compensated by the rest of society for providing that ecosystem service, as it's known in academic circles. Also, in terms of water retention, it can help keep healthy soils can help keep water on the farm. That can help eliminate flooding downstream and also erosion on farm. And it also can result in less off-site pollution. The single best way to cut down on the runoff of nitrates and phosphates off of farms to pollute water bodies and water wells in the Gulf of Mexico downstream is to use less fertilizer in the first place, which regenerative agriculture allows one to do. So there's lots of benefits from healthy, fertile soil, but there's also connections, as Ann will be talking about more a little later today, between the state of the land and the health of crops and farm animals and people. And we can look at the societal level that I wrote about in Dirt and think about how the degradation of the land can undermine the ability of a landscape to support human populations at a large scale, and we can think of how poor soil health can influence the health of societies over centuries and millennia. But we can also think about it in terms of our individual effects, which is something Ann's going to talk a lot more about when she describes our most recent work in What Your Food Ate, which looks at how we can reverse that by, if we rebuilding healthy soils can actually help support not only the health of our crops and farm animals, but it can actually help support the individual health of people as well. And so I would argue, and I think Ann would argue as well, that if we look at the state of the land, there's a relationship between how the health of the land, the health of our soils actually can influence the health of our societies at large, and also what goes on in our own bodies. So where does that leave us today? It leaves us essentially, I think, on the cusp of what I like to call a new agricultural revolution. So and I would say the fifth agricultural revolution. So what are the other four? Well, the first one was the idea of agriculture in the first place, the idea of cultivating and tilling the land. This is the Greek goddess Ceres, the goddess of cereals. And the idea of agriculture radically reshaped the trajectory of humanity, taking us out of a hunter and gathering existence into the path that led us to the development of larger societies with cities and all the innovations and things that have flowered from that, right up to the idea that I could be sitting here in Seattle talking into my computer screen and addressing an audience in another country on a different part of the world. The agriculture has served us well as the foundation for civilization, even if it has undercut the ability of the land to keep supporting societies, and engineered, in effect, a modern crisis that we need to solve this century to pave the way forward. In terms of the second agricultural revolution, the way I like to look at it, it was the discovery of various aspects of soil husbandry, how to actually help sustain the fertility of the land, and the idea of planting legumes in crops and crop rotations, which relate to two of those three principles of conservation agriculture I was talking about earlier. Those two things are not new ideas. They were independently discovered, adopted, and practiced by traditional societies all over the world, in Asia, in Africa, in North America, in Europe. And so I think that the second agricultural revolution, in my mind, was a distributed one based on the lived experience of generations of farmers who figured out gradually how to take better care of their land. But the problems with soil loss due to tillage and disturbance of the land undercut their efforts over the long run in society after society. And I just love this quote from Leonardo da Vinci, that we know more about the movement of celestial bodies than about the soil underfoot. How many quotes from science from 500 years ago can you offer up today and argue that they're as accurate today as they were 500 years ago? I think that's one of them. The third agricultural revolution was really the development of mechanization and industrialization, the recognition that we can use soil chemistry to add particular elemental fertilizers, things like nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus, to boost crop yields, the idea that we could use fossil fuels to mechanize our operations and farm at a larger scale, really revolutionized agriculture in the late 19th and the first half of the 20th century in ways that, yes, increased the pace of soil erosion in many areas, brought us things like the Dust Bowl, but it also radically reshaped agriculture and deserves credit as the third agricultural revolution. I think of the fourth agricultural revolution as combining the green revolution and modern biotechnology, genetic engineering, as practices that really reshaped agriculture and boosted yields, particularly the green revolution in terms of crop production from the 60s up through the present day. That increase in global food production capacity helped fuel and accommodate the global rise in population that we now face the challenge of feeding going forward into the future, despite ongoing soil loss and soil degradation that is working against the trend of being able to feed the populace into the future. And so I will argue to you that what I call the fifth revolution is one that we're starting to see unfold in the modern regenerative agriculture movement. The idea that building soil health and prioritizing farming practices that build soil health is central to the future of agriculture is one that I think is arguing for rethinking the way that we approach farming and focusing it around soil health building practices as the key to a sustainable and highly productive and profitable agriculture in the future. It's the idea of combining the ancient wisdom of cover crops and crop rotations with modern technologies that allow us to do things like precision agriculture, that allow us to do no-till planting with no-till planters, that allow us to think differently about how we treat the soil in ways that can actually build soil health. And I think that this applies equally across the board in conventional agriculture and in organic farming. Both arenas have the opportunity to rethink key practices in ways and realign them in ways that actually promote and build soil health across the board. So, how this is going to unfold in the coming decades is really kind of anybody's guess, but I remain an optimist that we're starting to see the initial phases, at least, of a much wider adoption of regenerative practices as the basis for a future agriculture that will prioritize soil health building practices as the foundation for what we would see as good farming practices. So I will leave you there in terms of what I'm going to be talking about today. Anne is going to pick up and talk about our experience in the hidden half of nature, and also the connection to our own individual health in terms of what your food ate and how soil health translates into better health for both our crops, our livestock, and ourselves as we go forward. And if the format allows, I'd be happy to engage in trying to answer any questions. Obviously, I recommend the books for you. If you're most interested in history, I'd start with dirt. If you're most interested in microbes, The Hidden Half of Nature is your game. If you want the how-to in terms of regenerative stuff and the experience of farmers around the world, Growing a Revolution is the one to start with. And What Your Food Ate is how it all ties and wraps together into human health, which I think has huge implications going forward for potentially adopting these practices. So again, I apologize that I'm not able to travel at the moment, but I'm delighted that Anne was able to visit there. And so, Anne, if you're in the audience, happy Valentine's Day. I look forward to seeing you back here at home. And I know the rest of you in the audience will enjoy what she has to say a little later today. So I'll stop sharing my screen at this point and revert to the full format.
Thanks, David. We do have 10 minutes for questions if anybody has a question for David.
That would be great. And I can barely hear you, so maybe if someone can repeat the questions in a way I could hear, that would be awesome.
Sure.
And just for the record, this is not beer. This is hop tea. It's green tea and hops.
Is there any questions for David? Get to you in just 1 minute.
Hi, good afternoon, David. My name is Rick. I work with the Canadian Food Grains Bank, so we work internationally in terms of alleviating severe hunger, but then also working upstream. So I really appreciated some of your comments, and obviously you've done a lot of research and study. Actually, I'll say a comment first, and then end with a question. I appreciated you on that list of the benefits around healthy soil. You had obviously all of these benefits that were mostly, I guess, related to the biophysical world. And the one thing that I thought about was, adding that aspect of the social dimension. In, I think it was 2016, the FAO had a very clear statement, because it was kind of the inflection point when hunger really started to go up in the world. And they had this kind of circular, I guess it was just a little phrase, but they said you can have no peace without food security, and you can't have food security without peace. And so my question, in a sense, was, in your background studies, when we talk about demise of civilizations, how did you come across that? Was conflict an aspect to that, in terms of what you had? I have your book, Dirt, and sad to say I haven't read it yet. But how readily did you see conflict kind of woven into some of those stories?
The wonderful thing about books is you can read them completely on your own schedule. One of the things I came away with in writing Dirt was the idea that the state of the land, this whole sort of soil building and erosion cycles, what you could think of as the long wavelength periodicity of the rise and fall of civilizations is kind of following that. But it's things like conflict with neighbors, things like droughts, things that challenge the resilience of a society are the ones that actually take civilizations out, but the vulnerability to it is set by the state of the land. So I think they're connected, and there's very much a connection between food insecurity and shall we call it geopolitical insecurity. And one of the big worries, I think, over the next century, is to what degree will food insecurity in certain regions of the world translate into broader instability in those regions and broader instability. And those examples of Syria and Libya today, I think, are good examples of how the degraded state of the land from even ancient erosional practices is continuing to impact the food security and the political security, the conflict situation today. And you can trace some of that back into Roman times. I didn't trace that much of it back into Greek times. Plato did comment on it, but when you get back into Greek and Roman times, it's the amount of literature you have to review is pretty thin. But I think there's serious concerns about that today, and I think it's very well taken that essentially, food security is the foundation for political security, and peace is the foundation for food security. You can look at what's happening in Ukraine today as a good example of, the disruption that can happen when we disrupt the food supply through conflict. But it's also a very good example of shall we call it the unwisdom of primarily relying on just a couple grains for the dominant source of calories in the human diet, and for relying on synthetic fertilizer production, which Russia was a major supplier of, as the foundation for agricultural production. A distributed model of healthy soils growing a diverse diet is actually, I think, a better foundation for trying to keep the food supply resilient, and also and there's no substitute for peace. We simply need that as a foundation. Hopefully that came close to answering your question.
My daughter went to a soil fertility workshop for 2 days in Manitoba last week, and she come back fairly disgusted because they still talked about NPK and S and some microbes, and discounted regenerative agriculture completely. So I'm running across quite a few academics, particularly soil organic specialists, asking the question if we can change versus how we can change. So what's your experience with the academic world and their ability to change? Is there some real stars out there? I know Grandy and Cullenback and Colfro, and there's one other I can't remember, that are making new models, but it doesn't seem to be getting through.
Yeah, that's a really good question. In my experience, academics tend to be very conservative in terms of what they think is feasible or possible. And one of the things that I found quite interesting is when I will go to talk at in ag departments or at land-grant universities in the United States, where much of the agricultural research is done, the faculty are usually fairly split as to whether the ideas behind a lot of the stuff that I've been talking about here in regenerative agriculture are either crazy or the future. The grad students are really interested in it as the future. And I think it's really hard to actually confront the idea that stuff you've been teaching for 100 years might actually not be the best way forward. And I see that in my own discipline of geomorphology. Change comes slowly, and there's the old saw in academics that progress occurs one funeral at a time. And that I think it's challenging to get people to change the way they think about things. But I've actually been on enough farms that have been quite successful at rebuilding soil organic matter and their fertility that I know it's possible. Whether we will do it is a real question, and how to best do it is a very legitimate question. And also what's very legitimate in my view is what's the total upside potential of doing it? Because not everywhere is going to be able to do it as fast as other areas, and not every method is going to be able to do it. And there's a limit to how much carbon you can put in soils, and there's different kinds of carbon that hang out for different amounts of time in the soil. I think that what you'll probably see over the next few decades is gradually, as more and more studies start to look at some of the combinations of practices that are sort of central to regenerative agriculture, people will figure out what are the key ways to actually implement it successfully and move it forward. One of the things I've been very frustrated by in the academic world in looking into this, coming in as a geologist, as a bit of an outsider, and looking at a lot of the studies others have done, in agronomy, one tends to study single suites of practices. Someone will study just no-till, or they'll study the effect of cover crops, or they'll study the effect of diverse rotations. I think we need a lot of research at a systems level, which is much harder to do in most academic departments, because you can usually get one grad student to study one thing, and there's also the funding stream issue of there has not been much in the way of funding to actually investigate the systems of practices. So I think there's a lot of questions that need to be addressed still in terms of how to best implement regenerative practices in different areas. What I think is actually fairly clear already, though, is that systems of farming that successfully figure out how to engage across all three of those principles that underpin regenerative practices, the minimal disturbance, the cover crops, and the diversity, those seem to be actually fairly robust, but understudied.
any more questions from the audience? Did you have one?
Hi, David. My name is Patrick Fabian. I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you very much. As a producer, one of the things that I have seen over the decades, I guess, part of the problem is farmers are remunerated on volume, not nutrition density. And I was just wondering, from a 5,000 foot elevation perspective, has there been any work done on that where farmers are remunerated on nutrition content more so than just what we produce for volume? Because the regenerative concept is nice and it's wonderful, and it's something I fully support. The problem is, a lot of times it doesn't necessarily pay the bills. And is there a way that, like, to getting more adoption for broad acre to the concept, has there been anything done about looking at that? And I know that's going to be like turning around a battleship, but focusing on the nutrition aspect and remuneration as such versus our current model. I just wanted your comments on that.
Thank you, Patrick. You're going to like Anne's talk this afternoon, because the new book, What's Your Food Ate, really looks at the degree to which we can actually think about regenerative practices influencing the nutritional makeup of foods. And there do seem to be some differences that ought to have a market premium on them. But there hasn't been a lot of movement towards that. I know there's a lot of people interested in that these days, but to be honest, there hasn't been a whole lot of research. We pulled together everything we could find in writing What Your Food Ate. And I think that there's a way forward there. I think that one of the things that one can point to in terms of potential consumer interest is that, if you look today, if you forget regenerative agriculture and just look across the last 20, 30 years of agriculture and through that lens of nutritional qualities of foods, the one label consumers have had to work with is organic versus conventional. And there's lots of controversy over sort of what those differences may be. We go into that in What Your Food Ate, and Anne will probably talk a little bit about that this afternoon. But where was I? But there has, so with, the largest growing segment of agriculture in terms of consumer purchases in the U.S. for, I think, a couple decades now has been the organic sector. And it's generally higher priced than conventional, and it's been driven by consumer choice because they believe they're getting a product that they would prefer to have put into their bodies. And so I think there's actually a fair amount of room for thinking about if the differences between regenerative and conventional production do pan out in terms of the kind of stuff Anne will be talking about this afternoon, that we do have some preliminary data that suggests a may. I think there's avenues for thinking about how to do that. You're absolutely right that I think a lot of the driving, a lot of what the simple pursuit of yields, both in terms of the goal of production and in terms of the compensation of farmers for production, is something that has not necessarily panned out in terms of the quality of food or the nutritional profile of what we're getting. And the connection of that to our diet and chronic illnesses in particular going forward, as Anne will talk a bit more about this afternoon, is one that deserves a lot more attention at a policy level, which ought to hopefully engender a rethink in terms of how we compensate farmers in terms of what's in what they're actually growing. But at the moment, I think the conversations around that are pretty embryonic.
Well, thank you very much, David. That was an excellent presentation. On behalf of SaskSoil, can we get a round of applause for David?
Thank you, much appreciated. I'm delighted to have been able to speak, and I'm just sorry I'm not able to be there in person. I'd love to meet and talk with you all a little more informally, but I obviously wish Anne the best in her presentations a little later today. Thank you.
Thanks again. So we're going to take a quick break here till about 3 o'clock. So grab a coffee and mingle a little bit, and we'll see everybody back here at 3 o'clock.
Okay, I would like to welcome our next speaker, Anne Biklé. Anne is a biologist, science writer, and public speaker. She explores connections between the health of land and people. Anne co-authored The Hidden Half of Nature, The Microbial Roots of Life and Health with her husband, David Montgomery. The second book of the Dirt trilogy, it tells the story of humanity's tangled relationship with the microbial world in agriculture and medicine. Anne has a bad case of plant lust and uses soil to coax plants into rambunctious growth or nurse them back from the edge of death. Her gardening practices have been featured in independent and documentary films, and her work has appeared in magazines, newspapers, and radios. Please join me in welcoming Anne.
All right. All right, thank you for the introduction. And I have to say, the R in Regina reminds me of how refreshing the wind is out there because I was out for a walk earlier, and I mean, I knew to bundle up. I brought a coat and stuff like that, but I'm like, okay, the scarf is coming further and further up my face. So, still, it is refreshing, and I always like visiting different places because it gives me, even just walking around in Regina, it gives me a sense of this place, of the people who live here, and what's important to them. So, without further ado, then, I'm going to get started. And I think David thought I was going to be talking about what your food ate, the most recent book today, but in fact, I'm going to be talking about that tomorrow. So I'll clue him on that later. Today, this afternoon, I'm going to focus on the hidden half of nature. And so this is an interesting book for us. It was our first collaboration. We never really planned to write a book, much less together, but there you have it. And the book started out, we thought we were going to be talking about carbon and saving the world and saving soil. And then the more we got into the research, it's like with a lot of things in life, you don't really end up where you intended, but in some ways, it's an even more interesting place. So I would have to say about The Hidden Half, this book is really about insights into the microbial world. And for both David and I mean, even though my background is in biology, it was not in the micro part of biology. I've always considered myself kind of a plants and animal gal. And my training in biology at that is more in the discipline of natural history. So this stems from the times when biologists were not locked up in a lab. They were out in the land looking at landscapes, looking at plants, looking at birds, trying to figure out how does the natural world actually work and what are all of these organisms doing out there and how do they relate to one another. But in fact, that kind of training and thinking proved pretty valuable in this book. And when I say insights into the microbial world, I'm really talking about microbiomes and their impact on two of humanity's, what I consider our greatest, if not, most ancient endeavors. And of course, that is agriculture. How are we going to feed ourselves? And medicine. How are we going to take care of ourselves if we fall and the arm breaks or disease strikes or something like that. And so this is what was interesting is that it allowed sort of exploring both agriculture and medicine in one book, also allowed us to connect the dots between agriculture and medicine. And I mentioned microbiomes, so there's a lot to know about microbiomes, and if you have read The Hidden Half, or if you're going to, you'll be fully saturated in them by the end. But just for right now, I just want to emphasize a few things. And so in its simplest terms, microbiomes are these specialized communities. Microbes are tiny one-celled creatures. They don't, one microbe, one bacterium by itself, you just can't get much done, okay? So you associate with other microbes in a community. And what's interesting about microbiomes is sort of the feedstock of one gets turned into excreted products, waste products, things like that. It turns into the feedstock for another. And that's what really kind of weaves and knits these communities together in many ways, as well as the actual kind of physical and chemical conditions that are around them. The second thing about microbiomes is that they really, the way in which they function and work, they dovetail intimately with cells and tissues of a host organism. And when you hear the word host organism, is that like going to a party? Well, a little bit, but not exactly. The host organism is just that other creature that the microbiome lives in. And microbiomes are not these foreign entities. You can think about them, they're sort of really indigenous to their host. And when I say that, when all is going normal and everything's functioning like it's supposed to, that's what I mean sort of by the indigenous use of that word. Because sometimes you can get other members into the microbiome that are not indigenous and they can be troublesome and things like that. But when everything's working well, these microbiomes, they're set, they're supposed to be in their host organism, it's good. And mostly what I'll focus on in this talk is that microbiomes are absolutely transformative when it comes to acquiring and processing and actually creating nutrients for their host organism. And I always hesitate, but I know this crowd has a broader mind. The term nutrient has sort of, the nutrition world got a hold of that word, as did the agricultural community, and it really has a narrow meaning sometimes within those two communities. And I want you to think about when you hear nutrient, just expand your mind a little bit, and what we're really talking about, what I'm talking about, is beneficial compounds and molecules. And sure, that could be something like a protein or a fat, but it could also be something that is not directly nourishing things, but it is feeding into the intelligence about how something works. And I'll unpack that a little bit later on. And so this is just to say that every host organism out there has got a microbiome. And every host organism has long been nested in and interacting with its microbiome. So the point of this slide is not that you memorize all these different colors. They represent some major groups of bacteria. And that's the other thing. This is just bacteria. Microbiomes consist of other kinds of microorganisms too. But you just see up here, you get a sense that it is complex, it's changing, and even within any one organism, the membership of the microbiome is different in the gut versus, say, on the skin, versus in the roots, versus up on the leaves or the fruit. So with that, then I want to just sort of keep those things in the back of your mind as I go through the rest of the talk here. And so for David and I, microbiomes, microbes, we really began to associate them with the roots around a plant and the human gut as well, and soil. And this story actually started, we don't have a farm. When I say we, I do have to fess up, mostly me. I was the one who was crazy and mad and raving for the botanical world and how we needed that in our lives, and that it was going to come about in the form of a garden, because we can't have a farm exactly in the city. So This is the first house that David and I lived in Seattle. And, you know, when I show this to people, like, say, from Arizona, they're like, oh my gosh, it's so green. Look at that lawn. And to other folks, you know, you're probably onto this, yeah, you know, green lawn, big deal. Well, to me, especially, this was a blank slate. This was the blank slate for a garden. This was not really what we were looking for, but it was what I was looking for to start with, to begin transforming and changing things. And so the scheming and dreaming began. And mostly what I was thinking of was, what is it going to look like, right? It was pretty boring and pretty awful before. And so that's where plants begin to come in and can change your life and enrich your life and change the world as well, whether we're eating them or just looking at them. This process of scheming and dreaming, I have to say, it went on for a couple of years. We were busy. I'm kind of a thinker. I like to explore every last detail, which has its ups and downs. But nonetheless, it provided a lot of fodder for what we might be able to do. And in terms of space, we had, you know, by our city's standards, a relatively big lot. For you all, no, you'll just laugh and think, that's the size of the driveway, lady. But for us, it was most of that open area was all on one side of the house. So it wasn't like we had these scattered little bits around. So I had one big chunk, and that was really wonderful. Except that all the scheming and dreaming, and we had a little bit of heavy equipment out there, moving things around, getting things prepped. And I was so enamored with the plants, and what is not on this slide is the dozens of plants around the corner that have been nipping at my heels like a herding dog to get them out of their pots and into the ground. And then this is the day arrives to get them out of their pots and into the ground. And this is one thing you never ever do really anywhere. And these days, especially in Seattle, you can't even get away with it. And that is, you do not start your planting project in mid-August. That is a really bad idea. But one thing led to another, and that's where we were. However, you may be looking at this going, she thinks that's good soil? That looks like crap. Well, I happen to agree with you, and it actually sent me into a complete and utter panic at the state of the soil. You'd think Dave or me might have looked into our soil a little more deeply before we started on this project, but we were busy. The plant person's in love with the plants. The geologist is, you know, writing dirt about soil eroding and so on. And so here we were. So the panic ensued, and I considered this really to be the beginning of my education as a gardener. And I call it the Organic Matter Chronicles, in part because I had done enough gardening prior to this. Not a lot. It had always been like, you know, 6 months here or there at some place we'd been renting, or, you know, going between college and graduate school, and you do what you can with what you have where you are. But I had always dreamed bigger and wanted something more. So in the past, of course, you don't have any money to buy anything, so it was scrapping around for organic matter. And so I thought, aha, that is what I'm going to do again. So I painted that wheelbarrow up because I needed to move fast. It is mid-August. These plants are in the ground, screaming at me with their little planty voices. And so we'd blown the budget on the plants and on, you know, the prep work and things like that. And so I thought, but the organic matter, I know that I have seen it in this town. It is cheap, it is free, it is nearby, and I am going to get it, and I'm going to bring it home by the truckload. And so up here are various kinds of organic matter that is laying around a lot of cities, and that I see it and I think, these people are so stupid. Don't they know? Don't they know that you can use this, you know, to grow a garden and to bring soil back to life and to get healthy plants? And so anyway, I continue to indoctrinate my neighbors and so on with things like this. But one thing about this slide, okay, so you see a capital N like Nancy or a capital C like Charlie up there. All that means is it's primarily a nitrogen source or primarily a carbon source. And I'm pretty sloppy as composting goes. And I'm sure you all can relate to this, right? We don't all have time to do the perfect job with everything. And so you read up on composting, you're like, oh, okay. I just need to make sure I have more carbon than nitrogen. Otherwise, things might get messed up. So what my primary goal was in pulling all of these bits of organic matter together and storing them in my piles was to have more carbon than nitrogen. And I always like to go a little bit into the weeds on this because everyone says, that composted coffee grounds, what do you mean that's a nitrogen source? Well, because they say, but it's all dark brown. Shouldn't that be a carbon source? And in fact, if you think about it, this will make perfect sense to you all. Seeds, coffee beans are the seed of a plant, and most seeds tend to be pretty rich in nitrogen, in part because the job of a seed is to germinate. So it's not all of this, fibrous cellulose stuff like in the bark of a tree. So if you're into composting or thinking about that, seed sources are rich in nitrogen, and so this is why coffee grounds are a really good nitrogen source. I also like them because they've already been ground up into this nice particulate size. There's a lot of surface area there for the microbes to get at versus a whole coffee bean, right? Like I haven't yet counted up the particles per coffee bean, but it's a lot more than that single bean, right? So what am I doing with all of this stuff? I'm mixing it up in the flame barrow. And what you've got here, decaying wood chips, those are this is like my broth and my stock for a mulch. This is the best stuff that you can get into the base of any mulch mix, especially if the wood chips have been laying around for a little while, because you'll already have fungi inoculating the wood chips and starting to break it down. So I always like to start with wood chips. Plus, they're a really great source of carbon to soak up and mix with some of that nitrogen. Hinoki, that's just a coniferous tree. That's the evergreen clippings that you see in there. And this happens to be a springtime mulch mix where I'm pruning stuff. And so what all these other people do, they go and they put it in their yard waste bin. What do? I collect that stuff, and it's really fresh, and it's really full of nitrogen in the springtime because it's new growth coming out. And I strip leaves, and I put it all in its piles, and I make up my mulch mixes, and I go out and I layer this mulch on the beds to a depth of 3 or 4 inches or so. And I initially thought I was going to take this mulch and dig it into the soil. Why? Because I don't know why, except that this will sound familiar, because that's what we've always done, right? But I didn't have any time for that. I got plants that, need to be planted. I've got organic matter to collect and mix. I'm like, I'm just laying it out there. Maybe I'll dig it in later. Well, I never got around to digging it in, and it seemed like it was decomposing just fine up on top of the beds. And it was also really helping retain moisture in the beds. And when you put a fresh mulch out, especially one that looks like this, and to my eye, I like the look of that. I see nature in there. I see color in there. I see it kind of like, sort of my own little painting on the ground. But I want to emphasize one thing beyond the looks of mulch, and that is that diversity in your mulches is key. Getting a lot of, we don't want monocultures out there planted as living crops. We also don't want monocultures in our mulch, and this will make sense as I go on. So, and it allows me also to, whatever kind of organic matter I'm collecting, it's all usable. I'm not confining myself to, any one thing. And so, depending as well on what other neighbors have, I'll collect their stuff and always be thinking about getting as many different things in there as possible. All right, so those are kind of the composty, mulchy stuff. That's kind of what I call the dead goods. But there's the living goods. And so for a while, initially, I was brewing up compost tea. So I had a worm bin. So what's a worm bin? This is where waste food out of the kitchen is being fed to worms. These are my herds of animals. They're eating those food scraps. Their manure, it comes out as what's called, I don't know why they can't just call it, worm poop, but we have to call it vermicompost. So this is, worm compost, that is what is sort of the feedstock for this compost tea. I put it in a mesh bag, about 2 to 3 cups of it. Stick it in this 5-gallon bucket with dechlorinated or water that's been allowed to off-gas some. Put a little bit of nutrient solution in there, and then I turn the brewer on, and I get this aerobic brew going. Depending on, the particulars, temperature, the worm compost, how much nutrient solution, I let this brew for, 12 to 24 hours. If I don't quite have time to get it sprayed out, I leave it in the brewer for a little longer. And this is a great thing for young plants. Whether it's babies or kitties or puppies or chicks or whatever, young things need a little more help. And the compost tea in particular was just foundational for getting small, teeny plants off to a really good start. Or if there was some kind of a problem that I was noticing, some kind of blight or mildew or something, it's time for compost tea, and then I would spray it on, and the problem would pretty much clear up. Any excess, just kind of sprinkle it around on the soil. Okay, there's some people who say, oh, but that's so unscientific, and there's not really any studies on that. Plus, there's no standardization behind the compost teas. And I'm like, you're right, you're right, you're right. And have you ever seen a compost tea properly brewed aerobically, I will add, that has killed anything? People look back at me and go, no. And I'm like, so there we have it. Here's the thing. There's never going to be a standardized worm compost, standardized temperature, standardized nutrient solution, or a standardized problem out there in a garden or on a farm. So you don't really want the same thing over and over again. So I look at compost tea as, this living brew that so far in my experience, I haven't lost any plants to it. Now, I have been a little overzealous with mulch. I piled it too high around a tree, not at the trunk or anything, but a little too high over the roots, along with some other issues that poor tree succumbed. So there you go. You learn by failure. Who was it? What is that guy? Michael Thompson out of Illinois. He had the greatest line. Failures are not really failures. It's you learning things you didn't know yet. Something along those lines. So that's why I like learning through farming, through gardening, because it's so hands-on, it's so experiential, and most of the time, you remember your failures, and they sort of progress you on to bigger and better things, or at least we hope so. All right, so here's a slide of the soil that we started with, where that arrow is pointing to, and where we ended up. And so you saw that initial, my panic soil. There wasn't really any organic matter in there, none really to speak of. And here we are, this is about 3 to 5 years later, and all of this organic matter is accumulating from the decay of all of these mulches. And so, it's a bit of an exaggeration to say you can, regenerate soil or make soil, but you can certainly add to soil, and you can add to its functionality, and you can add to normalizing it. And by that, what I mean is, I think a lot of soils are functioning abnormally, and if you can get soils sort of back on their feet and functioning normally, you've won a lot of the battle around growing any kind of plant. All right, so here that's Dave's hands. That's the soil that we started with, that lighter stuff, and then about 15 years later, that's where we are with the darker soil. So this is possible to do. There was not really a lick of fertilizer, agrochemicals that came into the garden. It was a lot of elbow grease, I will tell you that. And it was, storing some stuff and hauling some stuff, but it's possible. Okay, so if all of this is happening below ground in the soil, you may wonder, I would wonder, well, what does that garden look like anyway? And so there's the edible part of a garden. Certainly we want something like this. There is the plants for the pollinators and plants for the people. You know, a garden is obviously different than a farm, and we have more leeway. We're not trying to make a living off of our garden, unless you're a flower gardener. And so you have the ability to be thinking, how are things looking through the season, and how can I match things up, and what do we really, want here? And so that's where I think gardens, and to the extent you can get this on a farm, there's elements certainly of sustenance and food. There's the solace and the peace that can come from being surrounded by plants. And then farmers always joke with me because they say, you don't have crops, and no, I do. I have crops of trees. And what's fun about the place that you live is you figure out what kind of plants you can sort of, I'm not growing tropical stuff because that would be stupid. It would die, most of it, and I'd spend too much time trying to coddle it. What you want to find is plants that have, some sort of semblance to the native plants of the region, and then you can bring them into the garden, or cultivars of them into the garden, and rearrange them and grow them. And I never thought that I would think trees are so neat. And I know that's odd to you folks out here on the prairie maybe, but probably if I lived in a prairie region, I would be saying, I never had any idea how cool grasses could be. But I happen to live in tree country, so my crops are trees. All right, I mentioned, the work that I did, but there was so much help that I got from things that live in the soil. The chompers and the chewers and the grinders, like this earthworm. This is pretty much where people, I think, kind of start and stop thinking about soil life, and I get that. We can get our hands on worms. We can see them. We can, we've all probably picked up some piece of soil or dug into something, and you find the weird writhing mass of worms, and then, wow, what is that? So those are the things that are memorable. But there's also, most of soil life is so small we can't see it. This is life forms around the size of a millimeter or so. And if you have a really good eye and a little bit of patience, you could pick up some soil and stare at it for a while. And probably you'd be able to pick out a few of these things. But if you had a hand lens, just a 10-power hand lens even, that would allow you to see even more. And so springtails, you may have heard of that creature. This is what one looks like. And what a lot of this soil life is doing, especially with practices of mulching or, leaving the residue down. And I really want to find another word for residue. And I mean, mulch isn't that great either, but we need to think, something more like, on a continuum. This stuff is not at the end of, the continuum that we put the word residue. Let's get down to the word, toward gold, right? Toward value, toward functionality. But anyway, most soil life is, if it's not interacting directly with the plant, it's decomposing all of this stuff. This is what has always been the relationship between dead plant and animal materials and the life of the soil. Just another decomposer here. And finally, we get down to the microbes, the tiniest of all. And of course, these, you're not going to pick up a hand lens and see any of this. That's a clump of bacteria there, that brown clump. And then the green object there, you'll see those circular sphere-like shapes. Those are spores of mycorrhizal fungi all around this root hair. And I'm going to now kind of segue into what put all of this together and what is really happening. And what we know about plants and soil and microbiomes is that the heart of the plant microbiome is in a place called the rhizosphere. So this is this, nano to millimeter wide zone around each and every root hair and root of a plant. Just sort of in your mind's eye, just sort of think about it like a halo, and you can trace it. And that area is called the rhizosphere. And it's where most of the life in the soil lives. And the reason for that is this. It's what I call the biological bazaar. And what is really driving this bazaar is this constant dynamic exchange of things between the plant's microbiome and the plant itself. And what really drives that are exudates. Exudates are cocktails that plants make. They send them out their roots, and this feeds the microbiome. It feeds things like fungi. So coating and swathing that root is all kinds of microorganisms. So that fetching fungi, as you all know, that's mycorrhizal fungi. It's connected to the plant at this end, and over there by the door, let's say its hyphae have been prospecting through the soil, picking things up that the plant can't necessarily get on its own. Feed that fungi exudates, and you have a pretty good pal hanging around. It's really, what you want. The other sort of main character here in the plant microbiome is bacteria. So these exudates come out, bacteria consume them. They're not off in the distant the distant part of the soil doing much for plants. Their work is right up close. They're consuming these exudates, and then in their little one-celled bodies, they are using that to fuel their own growth, and they're excreting other kinds of compounds, some of which are plant growth promoting hormones. So this is interesting to me, that the botanical world, and I hope you too, has farmed out this job of, a pretty technical chemistry job to the microbial world to make the growth hormone, and then the bacteria return that to the plant in exchange for exudates. So this is definitely a part of the world of biology that is one of the grandest and most ancient examples we know of a symbiotic relationship. And so, I think in every science there's always these tropes and these motifs that get set up early on. And then as the science progresses, new things begin to emerge. And I would have to say, we mostly think of evolution and change as occurring between, it's this head-butting kind of a thing, right? Where animals have to fight with one another, and then one evolves some trait or characteristic, and it outcompetes the other one. Rarely have we heard of the power of symbiotic relationships in evolution and how that might drive the survival of species. But it is important, it is real, and it matters a great deal, and it makes a lot of sense to me when you're talking about plants. They are sedentary. There is no headbutting. There is no getting up and running away or running toward anything. You have a completely different life strategy to deal with. And a lot of people will say, the rhizosphere and this whole symbiotic relationship, this is one of the most life-dense places we know about on our planet. It's not the coral reefs. It's not the tropical forests. It happens to be what is a relatively small area, but it is so chock full of microorganisms. That's what makes it so full of life and dense with life. All right, and then I just want to give you a sense, like, what is this? It's hard to see these organisms. And so this is just some mycorrhizal fungi prospecting their way through the soil and collecting various kinds of things and transporting them back to the plant. And I had mentioned exudates. They are a big driver of this symbiotic relationship. And there are, of course, plant scientists, and please do not try to read or memorize this slide either, okay? But these are the cocktails of which exudates are made. And the main thing here is, I just want you to know, there's carbohydrates that are in exudates. Flavonols are a kind of phytochemical. We have fats and we have proteins. This should be sounding familiar to you because they're not only meals for people, they're meals for microbes. So that is what is really happening. And this is part of the reason you want diversity in a farm or a garden. All of these plants have different genomes, and with these genomes of theirs, they are able to make different cocktails. And what that does is it helps to ensure biodiversity in its microbiome, because the microbes are not eating a monoculture of one kind of exudate. That just won't do. Fungi thrive on different things in bacteria. There's all kinds of other things also in the soil microbiome. Protozoans, this other single-celled organism close to bacteria but not quite, called archaea. So all of these things thrive on different things, and that is where you start increasing biodiversity in one place, and it has a ripple effect everywhere else. So exudates are important. A plant takes about 30 or 40% of its photosynthase. So that is, it photosynthesizes, it's using all of that energy to grow and do all the things that a plant does. It takes almost, a third to almost a half of that energy to make exudates. Now, I don't know any person that would go and put that much of a paycheck out on the sidewalk and walk away from it. No. And plants are not giving their exudates away for free. So it's a relationship that stays tightly coupled as long as everybody sort of lives up to their role in that relationship. And it also amounts to an awful lot of communication and chatter between the plant and its microbiome. We know, for example, that plants will send exudates down to the root microbiome. Bacteria will consume them and create compounds, not that help the plant grow or something like that, but they spur the plant immune system, right? So plants are kind of sitting ducks out there in the landscape unless they've got, an immune system that can turn on a dime, that's really robust, and that can push back on things like insect herbivores or even pathogens. And I think too often, whether in agriculture or medicine, we think we got to kill this thing. I mean, we got to eradicate everything, otherwise it's really going to get us. And we do in certain cases with certain things. But in general, what you really want, what this plant wants, it would be a lot of trouble to try and pump out some kind of chemical to kill insect herbivore after insect herbivore. As we all know, there's a lot of insects out there. What you really want is you just want to push this insect herbivore off your back onto some other plant that isn't as healthy, because that amounts to the same thing. You just want that insect herbivore gone. And so this is a lot of the communication and chatter and work and relationship that is going on with the plant and its microbiome. And in my mind, this is really about plant intelligence. And we think about the plant body out there, and we think about our own body, and we think, oh, the brain of the plant, of course, that's above ground. It's probably in the fruit or you know, the miracle of a seed or something. No, 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 no. Wrong, okay? Because here's where the brain is. That brain is below ground in the rhizosphere with, you know, with the microbiome. And brain food matters a lot. And these are 3 treatments. There's not going to be a quiz or anything, but 3 treatments are nothing, okay? Because you always want to, right? If you don't have to do anything, that'd be great, right? Another treatment up here is composted manure. Another treatment up here is conventional fertilizers. So I'll let you ponder that for a moment, which is which, and here are the answers. So the main problem with the NPK kind of lifestyle for a plant is that we all know that grows plants, because that's how we practice agriculture mostly. But what the NPK diet doesn't really do is it doesn't nourish the microbiome. So what that means is that all of this communication is paltry at best. Maybe it's not even in a language that the plant can understand. Maybe it's like every 10th word is all that the plant hears. Imagine you guys hearing every 10th word of this talk. You're doing, you know, you're out of here, you're doing something else, nothing is making sense. So because the microbiome isn't nourished, you get that paltry root system. And then you end up buying agrochemicals to compensate for the microbiome and everything that it does. What I was impressed with here is not doing anything. These happen to be tomato plants, by the way. Okay, these were the roots of tomato plants. Not doing anything isn't half bad. Now, I happen to know that soil was pretty good that these tomato plants were growing in from the get-go. But imagine, you know, if you didn't have a great soil to begin with, you're not going to even get that great of a root system. But the composted manure, that is about the nutrients that are feeding the plant. The plant is making exudates and getting that down to the plant microbiome. All right, so microbes indeed tiny and mighty, and yet they're mostly out of our minds because they're out of sight. All right, I'm going to pivot now to the human microbiome. And there's no way I'm going to stand up here in front of you and tell you that the microbial world is warm and fuzzy like babies and bunnies. No. We're sitting here still in a pandemic and have been through a lot because of the microbial world, okay? So some pretty dread pathogens have emerged from the microbial world. And this isn't new, but nor is it ancient history. It was only in the 1800s, there's more on this in the hidden half, that the great German microbiologist and the great French microbiologist, Louis Pasteur was the Frenchman, Robert Koch was the German guy. And they came up kind of between them. They had a big fight about this. But anyway, in the end, they came up with what is called germ theory. And it was a pretty nifty theory because they were able to show this sort of one microbe, one disease correspondence. One microbe, oh, this other disease. So that meant the bacterium that caused tuberculosis. Boom, now we know what that bacterium is and we can go after it. Smallpox, now that we know what that virus is, we can go after it. And so that works pretty good for the pathogenic end of the microbial world. And we have prevailed against a lot of pathogens. Obviously not all. There's COVID, HIV continues to be a problem. But this is kind of where germ theory, as I'll get into, it kind of breaks down when it comes to a community-based world like that of microbiomes. Because you've got tons of microbes in this community, and you really cannot extract a sort of one-to-one correspondence. This is about This is the ecological view of the world, and why a lot of people complain about ecology and biology, and why people might, like me, like to dance between disciplines, because it's really about the connections. You can go deep and learn a lot about one thing, but then you have to come back up out of the rabbit hole and start to put it together. So pathogens throughout human history have been a big problem. This is some of the earliest written epidemiology that's known. Dates from 1664 in the city of London. And what the purpose of this is they would go and count up who died of what, because the whole game plan here was, if we know why people are dying, then we can take steps to prevent those things. And pathogens were, I can see some folks like, oh, look up there on the list, yeah. So I want to point out here, plague. That's what they called it. They didn't know exactly like what pathogen was behind it, but over 7,000 people in about a week died of plague. This is why we care about germ theory, and this is why a lot of people still think germ theory applies to everything. But biology and the natural world as a whole, it's all about nuance. It's all about context. And so I want to now get into a little bit about the human microbiome. And what we know about the human microbiome, it's like not up here, most of it on top of our head, in our ear, on the outside. Most of it is in our digestive tract. And at that, most of it is in the lowermost reaches, the colon. And so it's really an ecosystem approach that you have with the human body. And if you were to take a cross-section through that lowermost reach, the colon, what you have here is, this is where all the stuff is, okay? All the microbes, all the half-digested food, all the stuff that's rushing through the colon. And then that's all up here. You have a thin layer of mucus, and you have one cell. There's a one cell thick layer between what's inside the colon and what's outside the colon. And what's outside the colon is a whole lot of your immune system. It's thought somewhere 70, 80, 90% of the human immune system is hugging the outside of the gut. And again, most of that is surrounding and hugging the colon. And so why? Why is it like this? Because you're literally from top to bottom. This is where we bring the external environment into our bodies. And our immune system is one of the most intelligent surveillance systems out there. It is very interested. It is very snoopy. It is very nosy about what has come into the body, because the job of the immune system is to protect the body. So it's constantly communicating with the microbiome that lives in the colon. And there's tons of different kinds of cells. The one, I don't even want to call it a silver lining, but I will say this. Most of us now are more aware of our immune systems. We know kind of what a T cell is. We understand the complexity of the immune system. And so this is a kind of an immune cell. It's called a dendrite. And it can run its arm up here between our own cells, and it grabs a sample from either a member of the microbiome or something in the colon. And it comes back down. This is happening maybe right now. Some of you, I noticed, had some snacks. Maybe this is happening now, or breakfast or dinner last night. So it's sampling this stuff, and it is going to communicate with other immune cells that, when appropriate, that's what all this messaging is about, it will start inflammation, because inflammation is the body's go-to way of dealing with pathogens, among other things. Also helps us heal wounds, kick out cancer cells, keeps us functioning normally. Other kinds of immune cells, this other dendritic cell, it's got a different sample and different information, and with that, it's going to stop inflammation. And so you really have this kind of teeter-totter situation between what's going on in the human gut and the microbiome, where if we need to turn on the inflammation, the immune system can get that happening, but once that's taken care of, then it needs to come back down, and that's where stopping inflammation comes in. I'll talk a little more about that tomorrow. So in my mind, I think this is another kind of brain. This is another kind of intelligence that is a part of everybody's body. Now, a little bit more on germ theory. So, after World War II, people who study epidemiology, medicine, and so on, they were noticing, wow, look, rheumatic fever, it's dropping, measles, mumps, all this stuff, all these infectious diseases were really declining steeply. This is thanks to clean drinking water, vaccines, and antibiotics. But at the same time, it was concerning because these other kinds of diseases that actually are not infectious, that is, germ theory does not explain these diseases, things like MS, various digestive disorders. They happen to have in common, a lot of them, some kind of disordered immune system. And so what those who work in this field have been examining and thinking a lot about is why is that happening? Why we've really improved human health from the standpoint of infectious diseases, but now it's these chronic diseases. And they're thinking and asking, are we missing some of our microbes? Could that be the reason? Because think about what's happening between the outside of the colon and the inside of the colon, and you've scrambled the microbiome, it's probably scrambled that communication as well. So the hypothesis is basically this: we may be missing some of our microbes. And that gets to the human diet. Remember, the microbiome, these are living organisms. You know that down in the soil. They are just as alive down in our guts. And they need nourishment. And this is terrible, isn't it? On Valentine's Day, I'm saying, no chocolate, no cupcakes, I'm sorry. No, what I'm saying is it's Valentine's Day, so you can, but not every day is Valentine's Day, right? So, the human diet has a huge impact on our microbiome. And what's interesting is you look into changes in the human diet. This slide shows from 1910 on the left to late 90s on the far right. And carbohydrate consumption, it's interesting, it's about the same today, more or less, as it was back in 1910, but the makeup of those carbohydrates is different. We used to eat, like I said, a lot of carbs, but it was high fiber. So in other words, we were not refining carbohydrates. We were eating whole grains. We were eating whole vegetables, whole fruits. We weren't throwing skin away and bran and germ and endosperm and stuff like that. We were eating it. And it happens to be that our microbiome can ferment that down in our gut and extract energy and also produce microbial metabolites with that. So where we're at now, however, is we're eating mostly refined carbohydrates. And this matters because as you descend down the digestive tract, the human genome, we can break down a lot of the foods in the human diet. And of those foods, most of them are broken down enough by the time you get to the lower part of the small intestine. They pass out of our intestinal wall into our blood, and off they go to our brain and our toes and wherever they're going and doing what they need to do. But there's this part of our diet that we lack the genes to produce the enzymes to break down all that, I'm just going to call it fiber, for big, broad classification. When you hear fiber, it's not just one thing. It is a whole lot of different parts of plant foods in the human diet, and that is what our microbiome thrives on. And this is why a diverse diet, especially of plant foods, is really important for us and for our microbiome, because we're running a biological bazaar down there. That is what really is happening. And if you're having trouble picturing it, this is what it looks like. Okay, however, what if I told you? I might have put the wrong slide in here. because I'm not sure if this is the soil or the gut or the rumen of an animal. I'm going to fill you in more on that, and I'll tell you. But in the meantime, you can kind of think, I wonder which one it is. Okay. So essentially, you have a bunch of personal alchemists down there in your colon, and they are producing all kinds of metabolites, all those chemicals over here. And the upshot, about 40% of the compounds and molecules circulating in the human body, mine and yours and everybody else's at any given time, is microbial in origin. It's not made by your body, and it isn't a part of your diet. It's made by our microbiome. So this begins to explain a lot of things about the profound influence of diet on us and on our microbiome. And so what we really want is we want microbial metabolites being produced in the colon that can help normalize that flow of information between our microbiome and our gut, as well as our brain. There's metabolites made in our gut that actually are used in our brain. Serotonin is one, so this is a neurotransmitter that influences our mood, if we're happy, if we're sad. And it was always thought, oh, well, serotonin, if it's used in the brain, it must be made in the brain, right? Some of it, but not all of it. Okay, and so when it comes to diet, here really is what we have happening. The Western diet, full of simple carbs. Our brain loves Valentine's Day, cupcakes, donuts, everything like that, right? But for the reasons I've explained, it's not so good for the rest of us. Gut health diet, sure, some simple carbs, just not a ton of them. The other thing about the Western diet that I haven't gone into more in the hidden half, but refined carbohydrates and some other things in the human diet. Too much protein is one of them. Microbes are eating all of this stuff because that's what they do. And so some microbial metabolites are not all that beneficial for us, which I'm not an advocate for anything other than an omnivorous diet. And the reason for that is that if you've got harmful metabolites being produced, you want beneficial metabolites coming around to knock them out and dampen them down. That is the main thing there. And that's where you can get a bucket load of good metabolites on a diet rich in plants. Not exclusively, but at least rich in plants. Okay, I'm going to continue on here. Okay, so as a biologist, I have always loved the tree of life. It's a picture. I'm a pictures and words person, and there's pictures and words on trees of life. And so you can think about this, and you can think about, well, where am I? Where are we? The cat, the dog, the donkey, whatever. Where is all of this life on the tree? So this happens to be this is a German biologist from long ago, Ernst Haeckel, and he's kind of specialized in trees of life. And I will say, we're so special, we're up here at the top, of course, right? Because that's how they thought back then, and many of us still think this way today. But the tree of life, as much as I love it, it's not really accurate. Kind of makes me sad, but it is true. Other biologists, what I call the reality of life, they took a look at sort of biodiversity over time, and they put it on a tree of life, and this is what it turns out to be. Most of the tree of life is microbial, all right? Surprise. Everywhere there's an M, a C, or a star, that's some kind of microbe. And here we are. We're actually less, we're kind of even less significant. We don't have our own branch. Dang it. We're a little twig on a branch, the animal branch, all right? And even weirdly, for some, is fungi. We are related to slime molds, I'm afraid to say, and fungi. And there's some really terrific new books out there on fungi, and we happen to be more closely related to them than some other creatures. But maybe that tells us who we really are. I'm not sure. All right, so these researchers go on to say this. Wow, 70 to 90% is not insects or animals, because that had always been the bias, insects and animals. It is actually microbial. And scientists being scientists, and you heard Dave say, you know, we're pretty conservative and change happens one funeral at a time. These folks were kind of on that as well. Here they say that these endosymbiotic, they're talking about all kinds of symbioses, on the outside of the animal, the inside of the animal, everywhere. These symbiotic relationships might be fundamental drivers of life. Are you kidding me? After everything I have talked about, everything that you all know and probably have seen glimpses and aspects of on your own farm, no, are fundamental drivers of life. That's pretty much how I see it. All right, closing in here on the final slide. So when it comes to microbiomes, here's really what I want to leave you with, and in particular around roots and guts. These are biological bazaars. These are places of nutrient processing, acquisition, and transformation. Some of those things, microbial metabolites that benefit us. This has a huge amount to do with immunity and defense in the host organism, in this case, plants and people. And this, I contend, is really a form of intelligence, right? Because long before we had agrochemicals and pharmaceuticals and agronomists and doctors, all we had were microbiomes. And so all of these other products that have come into our lives, it's not to say that they're not useful or not needed. Of course they are. We're living in 2023. But it is to say, let's not ever forget that there are these parts of our body, the plant body, the animal body, that are capable of imbuing us with health. And to the extent that we understand how those work and support them, you've got a pretty darn good health plan, if you ask me. So I'm going to boil all of this talk about roots and guts and soil just down to one phrase that I want you to remember, and it goes like this. Don't ever forget to mulch your soil inside and out. Okay, that concludes my part of the talk. I will just sort of as a prep for tomorrow. So David, of course, filled you in on the plight and problems of soil. He gave you some great information, the how-to. How do we fix this broken soil? And the hidden half, as I've just been through, maybe it offers some insights about a cure or some treatments that rely on a fundamental part of biology and nature and health. And, oops, I'm not sure what happened there. Okay, there's the great phrase, right? Here's where I'm going. Tomorrow, what your food ate is coming up. So that's the stakes of all of this, how we can fix things when we know what we're doing and then we know how to. It makes the food system and agriculture and human health, it puts it in a whole new light. Okay, that's it, and thank you very much. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Ann. Awesome presentation. For me personally, like you, I'm a tree geek, I guess. We just have an acreage, so lots of the broader agricultural stuff, doesn't apply specifically to me. So I really enjoy the talk about gardening and that sort of thing. We've definitely started that on our own garden and with our trees and that. So a couple questions I have for you. When you were talking about mulch, and first off, I was curious, pine needles, you said, great mulch, do you have to worry about like the acidity factor of pine needles and how much you would mulch with pine needles?
This is where the let's be efficient in our gardening advice goes with me. This is why I like lots and lots of different materials, because you don't no one single thing really dominates, with the exception of maybe wood chips. That's the only thing that I ever really have allowed to dominate in a mulch. So as long as you don't use too many pine needles, I think you're fine. Now, of course, there are some plants, and this gets more in the category of, well, you all would know probably better than I. I do know, however, there are some garden plants who love acidic soils. So if that were the case, then I might think, aha, I happen to know rhododendrons are really acidic soil lovers. Maybe some ferns are. So then I might go, I think I might go half wood chips, half pine needles, because I happen to have a bunch of pine needles hanging around. So that would be my response to that, that kind of thing. And then actually I've gotten a similar question about coffee grounds. But aren't all those acids, coffee grounds, it's just so acidic, and it's like, no, that's why we drink it. All of those organic acids are giving coffee the flavors and tastes that we love. So they've been kind of leached out of coffee grounds. Yeah.
And then another question I had is, you talked about like fresh grass and leaves. Is there difference, or in terms of if you've used dead leaves and dead grass and all that for your mulch?
Yeah, the fresher any kind of plant tissue is, the more nitrogen it's going to have in it. So you let a leaf dry up, or you let a grass blade dry up, and it's, the nitrogen's gone down, and the carbon type compounds have come up in that. So that's the only difference there. Now, commercial composting operations can sometimes get in trouble. In Seattle, all of our yard waste and food waste goes to a commercial composter. And when they first started out, they were having huge problems with, in the summer, spring and summer, the grass is growing like crazy. The yard bins are full of that. They had way too much grass in their compost mix, and that was a problem because it was too much nitrogen, and it was not composting and breaking down properly. But that's not... that shouldn't be happening, certainly at a farmstead or garden situation. They were not able to control the flow of material, and so that's where you can get in trouble with composting, is if you're not managing the feedstock, you're in a situation where you have to take the feedstock. I mean, that's the whole problem with these CAFOs, right? There's too many animals, and there's manure piles all over the place, which then become very problematic because it's too much of a feedstock for the land to handle.
Thank you.
Unrelated to your question there, sorry.
Hi, thank you, Anne. I came across The Hidden Half of Nature in about, I don't know, I think it was 2019. Did it come out 2018?
It was out in 2016, so
2016,
yeah.
okay. So maybe it was 2018, and I floored by it. I loved the book so much, so thank you for bringing it to the world. One thing that I've been working on and thinking about, and I'm going to sound like a big nerd, but I think you'll understand and maybe appreciate. So on the prairies, there's a lot of complexity in terms of the ecosystems. And if you're trying to create habitat for, say, pollinators, mulches are not good because most of our pollinators are ground nesters, and they need soil. And so I started looking into other ways to increase the microbiome and got into learning about the seed microbiome, especially seeds of plants that are still wild, and kind of the loss of that genetic variability as seeds are domesticated. And so it goes back to, I'm sure you're familiar with the work from, I think it's the University of, is it Iowa? They're doing a lot in terms of like prairie strips, planting like prairie grasses, prairie flowers between, like as intercropping. and just the depth of like the importance of something like that because of the seeds themselves that as they germinate actually inoculate the soil from their own microbiome. So I just wanted to know if you'd kind of learned a little bit about that and like the potential for seeds to help regenerate soils themselves.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and I'll just sum it up. So this person is noting that seeds have their own microbiome, and this is analogous to humans because in utero, people used to think something along the lines of a blood-brain barrier, like there's nothing from mom that can get into the placenta. No. Now we know that mom can inoculate the fetus with some microbes. So I'm not surprised, and you know more than I do about the seed microbiome, but I'm not surprised one bit, especially in a situation where you're dealing with native plants, that there's microorganisms that associate with that seed, and once germination happens, you want to have that seed right away be able to build up that symbiotic relationship so that the mycorrhizae are going off and getting what they need for the seed, and it's the right bacteria able to process the right kinds of organic matter in the soil to get that seed going. And it is a huge reason that planting native plants anywhere on a farm or in a garden is a part of this whole regenerative, restorative approach to, agriculture and gardening, because this is built in, right? If the seed microbiome can inoculate the immediate area around the soil, then, that sounds like an input. And for me, right, like corn and soybean are not native plants here. I don't know if anybody's working on, and this is, highly relevant to agriculture because most of these plants are not native to where we're growing them. But what about researching the microbiome of, different crop seeds and seeing what opportunities there might be to get a microbiome on a crop seed that's going to do some of the kinds of things that the microbiome of a native plant seed could do. So I think that's a really acute observation, and it suggests, yet another thing that we should be thinking about if we're trying to sustain agriculture and the planet and feeding ourselves. So, yeah, really interesting. Thank you. Oh, yeah, sure. Question? Oh, going to get the mic.
Hi, thank you. Two very quick, straightforward questions. One is, you had the one slide there in terms of just looking kind of at the root density between, basically control, conventional and composted manure. What's your experience, or what would you say in terms of the kind of a bit of a both-and scenario, or maybe a bit of a planned obsolescence in terms of utilizing composted manures or some type of organic source along with some type of, microdosing, some type of synthetic fertilizer with a planned, with some type of a planned decrease? What is, in your experience, is there merit to that?
Yeah, so that's interesting. So are you sort of asking, okay, you have these two sources of nutrients out there in agriculture, synthetic or, let's call it, nature-derived organic matter. And if one is looking at switching, kind of weaning off of one, taking one down at the time the other one comes up, what's the sequencing to think about on that? Here's what I would think. Experiment, of course. Do something, little bit random, but not totally. Like maybe you would start out with half and half on one treatment area. Another treatment might be, okay, 30% synthetic, 20% organic matter. So figure out something like that that you think would yield observations to you, the person doing it.
What happens when the prostate enlarges?
So, I'll have to talk about my trip to Saskatchewan and the voices that came into the room. So I put together some kind of thing like that for the person who's doing it that you think, yeah, I think I'll probably observe some differences, at this level, and this level. I think that would be interesting to do. The other thing is the seasonality of that and something you might think about doing. I mean, back to the seed thing. A seed is still, once the seed germinates, it's got a lot of work to do before it's going to get out enough of the green body, I'll just say it that way, that can really take up fertilizer and utilize fertilizer. I think that the organic matter-rich end of things ought to be more, this is kind of informed speculation, I think the organic matter-rich stuff ought to be maybe, and it's different here because you guys, it's cold temperatures into spring can last, so take that into account. What I'm trying to say is you've got this plant grown from a seed and you want to get it going along, and I think that's where the natural organic matter sources might be better because the microbiome is able to utilize those. And then as you get on in the growing season, then maybe you're putting like nitrogen on, maybe, I don't know, once the plant is really up and growing and it can utilize it. I mean, the cost of nitrogen fertilizer these days, I think it's great, and here's why. Because it will make us think. How much are we using it? How are we using it? And when are we using it? And those are really important things to think about. And to take our lead from plants, right? They know they're ginning up these exudates from seed to adult that change throughout the life history of that plant to have their microbiome get them the things that they need for a given growth stage. Like growth hormone. I don't think that's needed in the last 7 days of a plant's life. It's needed way earlier. Yeah, great question. I know that there was, we were a little bit late, and I'm here, tonight and tomorrow, so grab me if you've got any other questions, and then I think I'll just turn it back to folks here for the rest of the afternoon's program. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Anne. I will invite everyone to grab a quick coffee. We'll give you about 5 minutes to do that while we switch presentations over to Tanya. For anyone that is sticking around for the AGM after, we have books at the back for you if you want to grab one, and we will just take that 5 minutes now. Thank you.
So we're just going to start with a video. A&W is our platinum sponsor for the next 2 days, and they weren't able to be here in person, so they've sent a video that we're going to share with you.
We've made another big change at A&W to grass-fed beef. What does that mean, ranchers?
They're only fed grass and hay.
Everything you see out here is what they consume all year round.
When you have grazing on these grassland landscapes, it really encourages plant and soil biodiversity. See, that soil is alive.
The cattle and the ecosystem coexist, and they actually need each other.
They give back to the soil, which allows the grasslands to thrive.
You guys are grass farmers then.
Yeah, I guess we are grass farmers.
Perfect. And I'd like to just take another minute to thank our sponsors. Without our sponsors, we are not able to do events like this, so we really do appreciate everybody's support. So our sponsors include A&W, South of the Divide Conservation Action Program, Stock Growers Foundation, Grain Millers, Imperial Seed, Ducks Unlimited Canada, Alice New Acre Project, Sask Mustard, Sask Wheat, Federated Co-op, WGRF, Angelic, Prairie Mechanics, FCC, Sask Oats, Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, MNP, and K-Hart. So we had 2 new projects this year, a very successful conference in February, and a couple of other things that we've been working on the year. And I just wanted to give a quick highlight of some of those things. So in September of 2021, the board got together and held a strategic planning session to discuss the direction of the Saskatchewan Soil Conservation Association. While maintaining our strong connections with the roots of the SSCA, we decided to rebrand, and we now operate as SaskSoil, a name that reflects our expanded soil health scope. We have a shared vision of being the go-to organization for science-based soil health information, and we promote soil health in general rather than only conservation agriculture, which is where we started. We have also revised our mission statement, which is advancing agricultural systems that improve the land and environment for future generations. In 2022, we applied for phase 2 of the Agricultural Climate Solutions Living Lab project. With financial support from our partners, we were able to hire Luke Struckman to build our project and complete our phase 2 application for the project. We would like to thank Sask Pulse, Sask Wheat, Sask Oats, Sask Canola, Sask Barley, and Sask Flax for their financial support that allowed us to work on this application. We submitted an application on January 15th for phase 2 funding, and unfortunately we weren't successful. However, there were 2 awards in Saskatchewan, and we look forward to seeing those projects progress. On February 16th and 17th, we held our 33rd annual Soil Health Conference. Why Carbon Matters was the title, and it was held at the Saskatoon Inn in Saskatoon. We had 142 people in attendance in person, and 51 joined us virtually. We had a great lineup of speakers, including Joel Williams, Jay Fuhrer, Alden Donnelly, Kim Cornish, Kelly Dobson, and our producer panel of Blaine Jordis, Gary Richards, Michael Ferguson, and Stuart Cheddar. Thank you to everyone who sponsored or attended Why Carbon Matters and helped to make it the great event that it was. So we partnered with Regeneration Canada and hosted a field day in July, visiting the Axton's Family Farm and Box H Farm again. I'd like to send another thank you out to Mark and Laura and Derek and Tanis. I know that it's a lot of work preparing for these events, and you guys do a great job each year. We had about 60 people in attendance and discussed the practical application of soil health principles and how we manage our land with soil health in mind. The day started off in Minton Hall, where we had a presentation from Joel Williams, and then lunch, and we made our way out to the farm. Field activities for the Water Security Agency program went ahead as planned for the collaborative research project we have with the Water Security Agency, Glacier Farm Media, Discovery Farm, the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association, and the University of Saskatchewan. The project is assessing and evaluating the nutrient management for drainage mitigation and it's taking place at the Discovery Farm just outside of Langham. This project is due to wrap up in March 2024. Farmers for Climate Solutions has developed a national farmer mentorship program that will scale the adoption of on-farm climate-friendly practices across 2 million acres of land across Canada. The farm program gives producers the practical tools you need to build resilience in your operation and improve your bottom line through their online curriculum, in-person events, and online workshops. SaskSoil is pleased to be the implementing partner in Saskatchewan for their cover cropping and nitrogen management streams. If you're interested in getting involved in the program, either as a mentor or as a trainee, please come and have a conversation with me. I'd love to share more information about the program. Our other new program this year is the MARS program, which encourages the conversion of marginal cropland into perennial forage while increasing your profits and farming fewer acres. We pay you $75 per acre to convert farmland into forage, plus there's a $2,000 rebate with proof of working with a crop advisor. There really aren't any restrictions to the program. The only restriction, actually there is one restriction, you do have to keep it in forage for 10 years. There is a prorated payout if you want to get out of it, but you plant what you want to plant and you manage it how you'd like to manage it. Again, I have some more information at the SaskSoil table, and I'd be happy to share more details with the program. And last is membership. We rely on membership dollars to continue as an organization. For $100 a year or $250 for 3 years, you can become a SaskSoil member. If you're interested in more information about the organization, what we do, or becoming a member, please come chat. And I'd like to just take a minute to thank our sponsors for their support. Again, we're able to continue doing everything that we do because of the support that we get from all of you attending our events or purchasing a membership. So thank you.
Thank you, Tanya. So because of the topic and the reason we're all here today, that tying the idea of food and agriculture together a little more closely, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with the Flat Out Food series that has aired in Saskatchewan over the past couple of years, but myself and Derek Axon's farm have been fortunate enough to be involved in that. So we arm wrestled Adrian Halter, the production crew, I guess, the guy in charge anyways, and we're able to get him to put a real short clip together. And like I said, partly this is just something that ties in so well with why we're here today. And the other thing is that in the middle of February, this is full of beautiful green imagery that we could all use. So sit back, this is just a few minutes, and enjoy.
From the rolling fields in the south to the boreal forests in the north, Saskatchewan's food bounty overflows. As an author and journalist, I've spent the last decade tasting the best the province has to offer and telling stories to help us reconnect with our food. I'll take you on a field-to-plate journey to discover our finest ingredients and the people behind it all. Because this isn't just my story, it's Saskatchewan's. Lentils are renowned for their soil building capacity. The high protein pulse crop has been consumed throughout the world for thousands of years. Lentils were virtually unheard of in Saskatchewan before 1970. Today, the majority of Canada's lentils are grown here. They're delicious in stews and soups, yes, but Saskatchewan is famous for reimagining possibilities. Regenerative farmers Derek and Tanis Axton plant their lentils with another crop in the same field, which is known as intercropping. This method adds diversity, which equals healthier soil. Ooh, she's a beauty brain.
Yeah, I'll take it, right?
Yeah. Okay, what do we got out here?
Yeah, so this is
Wow.
this is our intercrop. And of all the intercrops we grow, this is the only one to date now that we grow in the same row, and we intentionally put them together. Because as the lentils mature and, you know, produce seed, the plant becomes heavier, and you'll notice, I know a lot of lentils, you know, if you drive down the highway, you'll notice the lentils will be laying down or nearly laying down at harvest. But these will stay standing really, really well.
Oh, it's so neat. Look how tall they are.
And I remember having that conversation with friends of mine that we used, we spray the fungicide because it just keeps them standing and it's better to harvest. Well, you know, finally you start to ask yourself, why are we doing this? And we're, you know, with this, it allows us to be, you know, maybe a little more profitable and, you know, not have to rely on an input to do it.
Like the flax is supporting them.
Yeah, they definitely do that. This is totally old technology. I mean, if you go back, I mean, well, right, this is, you know, corn, bean, squash, right back to
Yeah,
like,
three
right,
sisters.
You know, I'm not that smart. I'm just kind of take what somebody else figured out and, you know, just made it work for us.
Our farm is a true family farm. My wife and I and our 2 kids, we also work with my parents. When we used to manage the cattle, they were in larger pastures. So when we moved them to a summer pasture, they'd be there for months at a time. And we started to realize some of the benefits there were for moving them more often, and we got to where we are today, where a lot of times we'll move them once a day.
Mark and Laura, I can't believe your pastures this year. It looks incredible. Tell me what you're doing out here that's making it so vibrant and lush and green.
Well, we keep moving the cattle about once a day if we can, and the idea is to not to take everything, but just to take a little bit and allow the plants to keep growing and to recover.
The rule of thumb is kind of when it's green and growing fast, you move the cows fast, and then when it's growing more slowly, you can move the cows more slowly because you never want to let it grow back and then have them graze it again before while they're still in the same area.
So to me right now, I mean, this looks really healthy and beautiful. Why are you moving the cattle every day?
A big part of rotational grazing isn't so much planning what to do today, but what you want this to look like when you want to use it the next time. There's very few things we actually think about when we think about nutrients. We think about the protein and maybe the iron that comes in beef, but proper cycling soil and really healthy grass has many more phytochemicals and vitamins, and it's full of the little things that just help to make the livestock and the meat and eventually the people who eat it healthier. So this is kind of what we really like to see. She's got what you'd call guts. She's just a round.
Yeah, she looks so healthy.
Yeah.
How can you tell how they're doing at this point in the season?
The shiny coat is a really good indication of how healthy they are. The other is how fat they look. Like you can see a lot of them have a decent round to their belly and
a flat back kind of and rounded on back. And they, because they move every day, they know that this means new grass right away, so they come. Yeah.
So that's why they're so excited. They're not excited to see us necessarily. They know they're going to be going to new grass right away.
Excited to go past us. Yeah,
it's supper
that's
time.
right.
They don't all have the same personal space boundaries.
Right.
Yeah, they're not opposed to bumping you if you're in the way.
They may not respect my bubble.
That's right, they may not.
All right, well, let's get going. How do I do this?
We're going to put these 2 together.
Okay.
I'll let you do that.
All right.
Yeah, you want the notches at the top. Yeah, and then we're just going to lift the fence and let them through.
Okay. Are you ready, girls?
I'd say yes.
So, yeah, the Flat Out Food Series is just another example of there's so many people within our province doing really neat things, and there are many more episodes other than the beef episode and the lentils. I can't think of what they are right now. The beef one is really the good one to watch, but they're on City TV, and they season 3, as you saw there at the end there, will be coming out on March 15th, and they're very interesting, and they tie together the production and some of the processing, and then some of the end product, and it's just a great example of how everything should be tied together and how we should think of everything as a whole. That wraps things up for today. Oh, yes, except for the AGM, which I know is the reason that everyone came. So we are going to have a quick AGM here. We'll start in just a few minutes, but so if you would like to stay, you are more than welcome to stay. If you want to do some visiting, you may want to move out into the hallway because we have board positions available. So I might mistake someone who's in a deep conversation with someone who's really interested with getting on the board. But anyway, we are having a reception here at 6. There's something to eat, and there's going to be drinks available. So please make sure that if you do leave for a little while during the AGM, that you come back. And we will see if, yeah, we'll see you later. All right, I guess we might as well get started. I seem to have sufficiently cleared the room out with threatening to let people on the board. So we will call the meeting to order. First on the agenda is to approve the agenda. So could I get a motion for that? Derek? Can I have a seconder? Marissa? All in favor? All right, carried. Next, get a motion to approve the minutes from last year's meeting. Cody? Marissa seconds again. All in favor? Thank you. You next.
So I'm just going to quickly review the financial statements. This first letter identifies that the review engagement report, or the review engagement was clean and there were no issues identified in the review. Our assets decreased from 2021, partially due to a withdrawal from our short-term investments to assist with operating costs. We took this money out before we got our 2 new projects. We took a year's worth of operating costs out of our investment. With these new projects that we have, we're hopefully on track to start contributing to our investments again, and we'll start to increase those. The deferred revenue in 2021 was from the Water Security Agency project, the ACS Living Lab project, and there was some bus tour income. So we have transferred all money from deferred revenue over to income this year. So the only thing left in deferred revenue now is a payment that we have committed for 2023 and for 2024 to the University of Saskatchewan for the Water Security Agency project. Statement of fund activities. So this statement just identifies all of our revenue and expenditures for the year. We had $210,664 in revenue, which is up quite significantly from last year, and that was due to our projects that we had last year. And our expenditures were also significantly higher than the previous year at $154,365. We had an excess of revenues over expenditures of $36,564 for the year. So I'm just going to skip to the next. So just one thing I wanted to point out on this is the investing activities. This is the $60,000 that we withdrew from the investments to cover operating costs for 1 year. And then that is the end of the financial review. Did anybody have any questions about the finances? Yeah. So this next motion, in our bylaws, it requires that we have an audit done. And because we don't get an audit done, we get a financial review done. We just ask that the membership approve that so that we can do a review over a full audit.
So does anyone have any questions about the financial statements or about anything that we've read over here? If not, could I get someone to make a motion to approve the financial statements as is? Tyler, seconder? Rob? And all in favor? Go over the budget? Not yet. Okay. Next motion is to appoint Laskowski and Wright as the auditor for the year ending in October 31st, 2023. If I could get a motion for that. Derek? And Maurice? And all in favor? Next is the motion to waive the requirement for a full audit. Could I get someone to make a motion for that, please? Rob? And a seconder? Tyler. All in favor?
So after having a number of years with a negative bottom line, it's nice to see that we're starting to go in the opposite direction. And we have a profit again this year in the budget, and we're hoping that it'll be even more. We do have some revenue from the farm project that we're going to be getting this fiscal year that isn't reflected in the budget because we don't know what the amount is yet. So we're hoping that the profit will be a little bit more than what we've budgeted for. For revenue, we've budgeted for $10,000 for bus tour and events, $20,000 for conference registrations, $30,000 for conference sponsorship, $15,000 for memberships, $5,505 for the Water Security Research Project, $55,000 for the Farm Project, $55,000 for the Mars Project, and our total revenue we're projecting is $190,505. Our expenses, we're anticipating $1,500 in advertising and promotions, $1,500 in bank service charges, and that line includes credit card processing, which is why it's so high. For events like this, we get hit with credit card processing fees. Board expenses of $5,000, event expenses of $7,500, conference expenses of $30,000, conference speakers of $16,000, contract work of $60,112, contractor travel of $500. Our insurance cost is $1,500 for the year, and that's the office insurance as well as board director and liability insurance. $3,500 in office expenses, $250 in other expenses, $5,505 in the Water Security Agency Research Project, $2,300 for our review engagement, $1,000 for websites, $20,000 for Farm Project, and $30,000 for the Mars program. So our total expenses we're anticipating are $186,167, leaving us with a profit of $4,338. Does anybody have any comments or questions on the budget? Sure. Yeah, so with both projects, the organizations that have given us funding for those projects, they've included administration dollars that just goes directly into our pocket.
Are there any other questions? If not, if I could get someone to make the motion to approve the 2022-2023 SaskSoil budget as presented. Cody? And seconder, was Austin. All in favor? Excuse me. I will make this quick. As I wrap up my term as the president of SaskSoil, I feel lucky to have had the opportunity to work with this amazing group of individuals. From farmers to researchers, we're all united in this goal of improving health of our soils, and I've learned a lot from the others on the board. I know we still have a lot more work to do, and I look forward to see how this organization can support the work of soil health stewards in Saskatchewan in the future. Our executive director, Tanya Craddock, has kept everything flowing smoothly, and I'm grateful to her for all the work that she's done for SaskSoil. Over the past year, SaskSoil has connected with producers through the Mars and Farm programs, building partnerships with other organizations to help fund the good work producers are doing and to share the knowledge with the aim of building soil health on farms. We are fortunate to have the beautiful weather and great turnout for today's We were fortunate to have beautiful weather and a great turnout for our field day in Minton and Gladmar in July, and to have held a successful conference last year in February in Saskatoon. Every time we have the opportunity to get together, each of us goes home with a new idea or a new connection that makes us strive to do better. As we are learning at this conference, good soil really does make good food, and as an agricultural province, we need to look to the health of our soils to grow good food the consumers are asking for. Looking forward, SaskSoil hopes to work closely with existing partners to build new relationships so that we can help support producers doing the great work for our land and our soils in Saskatchewan. And now for the director elections. So we just, which one? We had one producer position and 2 supporting or associate member positions up for election this year. We've received nominations from Cody Straza. No, this is Mark Heimer, apparently me. I'm up again. And wasn't Chuck last year? This is definitely from last year. Yes. So we received nominations from Mark Heimer and Rob Wonder. You're not getting off the hook just because there's a typo, Rob. And also Austin Barton. Are there any, and how many positions do we have available?
We have 5 positions available.
5 positions available. So now is when the people left in the room start checking their phones. Is there any interest from anyone else to put their name forward to join the SaskSoil board? That's a maybe. We'll let you join later, too.
I'm happy to have a conversation with you after the meeting, just to go over what the expectations are of our board, and the requirements, what all being a board member entails, and if you are interested, we can bring you in at a board meeting at a later date.
So do we move nomination cease now, or? All right, this is the motion we have in front of us, that those who've put their name forward are re-elected to the SaskSoil board for a 3-year term. Anybody willing to? I thought I could. Cody and Maurice. All in favor? All right, that's it. Only one thing left. Could I get a motion to adjourn the meeting, please? Derek. That's it. That's all. Thank you, everybody. And
The food will be out in about half an hour. Please stick around for a drink, and I'll see if I can maybe get it brought out a little bit earlier.
all right. Thank you.